There is a version of Canadian history you were taught in school. Polite, orderly, a country built on beaver pelts and hockey rinks and modest ambition. A place where nobody got too rich too fast, where fortunes were earned slowly, where the land itself imposed a kind of humility on everyone who tried to tame it. That version of the story is almost entirely a myth, because underneath the surface of that quiet, well-mannered national identity, there are families. Families whose wealth arrived with a speed that makes no sense. Families whose origins dissolve into fog the moment you start asking the right questions. Families who appeared seemingly from nowhere, holding deeds to land that no one remembers them buying, licenses that no one remembers them being granted, connections to power that no one remembers them earning. And the strangest part of all of this is that nobody questions it. Not really. The money just sits there, enormous and ancient and untouchable, and the families stand behind it like monuments, and the country builds itself around them, and the questions never get asked out loud. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments, and there is something remarkable about it. Someone in Halifax at 2 a.m, someone in Vancouver at midnight, someone in a small town in Ontario who cannot sleep and wants to understand the country they are living in. You are all welcome here, because what we are going to do tonight is go back, not to the history you were taught, but to the history that was left out, the real story of how Canada's wealthiest families got their money, the land grants that should not have existed, the licenses that arrived before the businesses did, the political friendships that seem to have been formed before anyone involved was old enough to have met, the fortunes that emerged from the wilderness, fully formed, like something that had been buried there for a very long time and was simply waiting to be claimed. We are going to start with the oldest, the family that built an empire on something everyone needs and nobody thinks too hard about. The family that turned a simple biological process into a dynasty that has outlasted every government, every recession, every war, and every scandal Canada has ever produced. We are going to start with the Molsons. John Molson arrived in Montreal in 1782. He was 18 years old. He was, by every official account, an orphan from Lincolnshire, England, with almost no money and no connections. He had crossed the Atlantic alone on a ship that took weeks to make the passage. He arrived in a city that was still essentially a French colonial outpost under British military administration, a place where power was held by a small, insular group of English merchants who had no reason whatsoever to welcome a penniless teenager with a vague story about his background. And yet, within 3 years, John Molson had purchased a brewery, not borrowed the money, not partnered with someone who had the capital. Purchased. In 1786, at the age of 22, he acquired the brewing equipment and facilities of a failing operation on the St. Lawrence River and began producing beer at a scale that immediately made him a significant commercial presence in Montreal. Where did the money come from? The official story is that he inherited a small sum from his grandfather in England, a sum that arrived by letter of credit just in time to fund the purchase. And that may be true. But the number that is usually cited, somewhere between a few hundred and a few £1,000 sterling, does not quite square with what Molson was able to do with it, because he did not just buy a brewery. He built a financial infrastructure that, within a decade, made him arguably the most powerful private individual in British North America. By 1797, he had expanded the brewery to the point where it was supplying the entire Montreal market and exporting to Upper Canada. By 1809, he had launched the first commercial steamship service in North America, the Accommodation, which ran between Montreal and Quebec City and transformed the entire economic geography of the St. Lawrence corridor. By 1816, he had founded what would become the Molson Bank, one of the first chartered private banks in Canadian history. He built the first theater in Montreal. He helped finance the Champlain and St. Lawrence Railroad, which was among the earliest railways on the continent. He sat on the boards of the institutions that were quietly deciding what the future of Canada would look like. All of this from a young man who arrived with, by some estimates, the equivalent of a few months' wages. There is a peculiar detail in the early records of the Molson family that historians have noted but rarely emphasized. John Molson was a Freemason, not casually, not peripherally, but deeply and consistently involved with the lodge system from almost the moment he arrived in Canada. He was a member of St. Paul's Lodge in Montreal, which was at that time one of the most politically connected Masonic lodges in British North America. The lodge was not simply a fraternal organization, it was a network that included military officers, land administrators, judges, and the men who were making decisions about who received government contracts, land grants, and commercial licenses in the colony. Now, the Freemasons are not a conspiracy. They are a fraternal order with a long history and a complicated reputation, and it would be a mistake to suggest that membership alone explains anything. But what membership did provide, especially in the late 18th century, in a British colonial city far from any traditional centers of power, was access. It provided introductions. It provided trust between men who had not grown up together, who did not share a blood lineage, who needed some other form of credential to establish that they were, in the language of the lodge, on the level. John Molson used that access masterfully. His applications for licenses, for land, for the right to operate a steamship monopoly on the St. Lawrence, moved through the colonial administration with a speed that was not typical. His competitors applied for similar permissions and waited years. Molson applied and received responses in weeks. The men reviewing his applications were, in several documented cases, members of the same lodge or members of lodges connected through the larger network to which Molson belonged. This is not to say the business was not real. It was real. The beer was excellent by all accounts, and Molson was a genuinely capable operator who worked extraordinarily hard. But the foundation on which that capability was built, the initial access to capital, the speed of regulatory approval, the quality of the political relationships that protected his monopolies from competition, that foundation came from somewhere that the official story of the immigrant orphan with a small inheritance does not fully explain. There is another element to the Molson story that gets even less attention. When John Molson built his brewery on the south bank of the St. Lawrence, he was building on land that had a history before him, land that, in the indigenous understanding of the territory, had never been available for private purchase in the first place, because the concept of private land ownership, as understood by English commercial law, was not a concept that existed in the cultures that had been using that land for thousands of years. The land along the Montreal waterfront where Molson established his operation had been subject to a series of colonial grants dating back to the French regime and then reorganized under the British seigneurial system after 1760. The details of how specific parcels passed from one set of hands to another in the chaos of the post-conquest reorganization are, in many cases, genuinely obscure. Records were lost, grants were backdated. Administrators who had the authority to assign land used that authority in ways that benefited their networks, which is to say, in ways that benefited themselves. What Molson acquired when he acquired his waterfront property was not simply a physical location. He was acquiring a position in a legal and commercial landscape that had been created by a particular set of colonial decisions that had dispossessed the original inhabitants of the territory and reorganized the remaining population in a hierarchy that placed English-speaking Protestant merchants at the top. Molson was English-speaking and Protestant. He arrived at exactly the moment when that hierarchy was being consolidated. He arrived with the right credentials, found the right network, and in a very short time became one of the primary beneficiaries of a system that had been designed, whether explicitly or through accumulated practice, to produce exactly that kind of result. The Molson family held the brewery for 200 years. They sold it in 2005. By that point, the Molson brand had been woven so deeply into Canadian identity that it was effectively invisible as a commercial entity. It was simply Canada, Canadian beer, Canadian hockey, Canadian winter. The family name on the side of the arena in Montreal, the family whose money had funded hospitals and universities and cultural institutions across the country for generations. Nobody questioned where the first investment came from. Nobody asked why an 18-year-old orphan from England was able to, within a few years of arriving in a foreign country, build an empire that would outlast every political system Canada ever produced. The money was simply there. The family was simply there, and the country built itself around them. But the Molsons, for all their power, were never quite the most controversial dynasty in Canadian financial history. That distinction belongs to a family whose origins are even more obscure, whose methods were even less orthodox, and whose wealth arrived in a way that the official story has never been able to fully account for. The Bronfman family changed Canada, and they did it in a way that most Canadians have never been taught. Samuel Bronfman was born in 1889 in a small village in what is now Moldova, then part of the Russian Empire. His family were Jewish immigrants who came to Canada in 1889, part of the great wave of Eastern European Jewish migration that brought hundreds of thousands of people to the prairies and to the cities of central Canada in the decades around the turn of the 20th century. His father, Yechel, worked as a farmhand and then as a firewood merchant and then as a tobacconist and hotel operator in the small towns of Manitoba. The family was poor, not struggling, but managing poor. Genuinely poor in the way that immigrant families with few resources and few options were poor in that era. And then, within a single generation, the family became one of the wealthiest in the world. The conventional explanation for the Bronfman fortune is prohibition. When the United States banned alcohol in 1920, Canada did not. And the Bronfmans, who by that point had moved into the liquor trade in Saskatchewan, were positioned to supply the American market through a network of intermediaries, bootleggers, and distributors who moved product across the border in quantities that made the family spectacularly rich in a very short period of time. That explanation is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. The first thing that is incomplete about it is the question of how the Bronfmans got into the liquor trade in the first place. In the early 1900s, before Prohibition, Sam Bronfman and his brothers were operating hotels in small prairie towns, and the hotels included bars, and the bars sold liquor. So far, so ordinary, but the transition from running a bar in a small prairie hotel to controlling a wholesale liquor distribution network that operated across multiple provinces required capital, political connections, and a sophistication of commercial organization that does not obviously follow from the hotel business. The Bronfmans made that transition with a speed that is, when you examine it closely, remarkable. By 1916, Sam Bronfman had established a mail-order liquor business in Saskatchewan that was exploiting a loophole in the provincial liquor laws. Saskatchewan had prohibited the retail sale of alcohol, but had not yet prohibited the importation of alcohol from other provinces. So Bronfman set up a business that allowed customers to order liquor by mail, technically importing it from outside the province for personal use. The business was legal, barely, and it was enormously profitable. But here is what rarely gets discussed. The loophole Bronfman was exploiting was the kind of loophole that requires either extremely sophisticated legal knowledge or extremely well-placed sources of information about what the government was and was not going to do about it. Someone had to tell Bronfman that this particular gap in the regulations existed and that the government was not going to close it, at least not immediately. Someone had to provide, at minimum, the assurance that this was a viable business, rather than one that would be shut down before it generated any returns. Who provided that assurance? The records from this period are fragmentary. What we know is that the Bronfman family had by this point established relationships with several prominent figures in Saskatchewan politics, relationships that had been cultivated through the hotel business and through the social networks of the Jewish immigrant community in the prairies. Those relationships involved men who knew what the government was going to do about the liquor laws before the government announced it. The mail order business lasted long enough to generate substantial capital. When it was finally shut down, the Bronfmans were no longer operating at the margins. They were serious players in the liquor distribution business, and they used that capital to make the next move. The next move was prohibition. When the United States went dry in 1920, the Bronfmans were ready. They had already been building relationships with American distributors through the legitimate side of their business. They had capital. They had product. They had a network of contacts who understood both the legal landscape and the practical logistics of moving large quantities of alcohol across a national border. What they built over the next decade was not simply a bootlegging operation. It was a logistics and financial system of considerable sophistication. The Bronfmans established export houses, businesses that were legally permitted to sell liquor for export under Canadian law, at various points along the Canadian-American border. The liquor was sold to American buyers at the Canadian side of the border, and what happened to it after it crossed was technically not the Bronfmans' concern. This was not, strictly speaking, illegal under Canadian law. It was a profound exploitation of the gap between what Canadian law prohibited and what American law prohibited, and it required, to work at the scale the Bronfmans were operating, the implicit cooperation of Canadian customs and police officials who were either paid to look away or who had made a judgment that this particular law enforcement priority was not worth pursuing. The fortunes generated by this system were staggering. By some estimates, the Bronfmans were generating the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars annually by the mid-1920s. The money was moving in ways that were difficult to track through a series of companies, some Canadian, some registered in other jurisdictions, some barely more than names on pieces of paper. In 1928, Sam Bronfman purchased Joseph E. Seagram and Sons, a legitimate distillery operation in Waterloo, Ontario. The purchase price was significant. The capital came ultimately from the prohibition business. What the purchase accomplished was a transformation. The Bronfman family went, almost overnight, from being associated with the shadow economy of cross-border liquor, smuggling, to being the owners of one of the most respected and historic names in legitimate Canadian manufacturing. The Seagram name was old. It was respectable. It was the kind of name that went on office buildings and civic donations and the donor plaques of hospitals. The Bronfman family wrapped themselves in that name and became, within a generation, pillars of the Canadian establishment. This is the transformation that the conventional account of the Bronfman story tends to glide over. The money that built the Seagram empire came from a decade of operating in the gray zone between legality and illegality, exploiting regulatory gaps, paying off or ignoring officials, and effectively supplying an illegal market with a product that was causing enormous social harm in the United States. None of that money was ever fully accounted for. None of the arrangements that generated it were ever fully investigated, at least not in a way that produced meaningful legal consequences for the family. There were investigations. In 1935, a royal commission examined the cross-border liquor trade during Prohibition and heard testimony about the Bronfman family's operations. The commission found evidence of practices that it described in measured language as irregular. No charges followed. The commission's report was filed, and the matter was, for official purposes, closed. And then the Seagram empire grew. It grew into one of the largest spirits businesses in the world, with brands and distilleries across multiple countries. The Bronfman family became significant players in real estate, in film, in media, in the institutional life of Jewish communities across North America. Sam Bronfman himself became a figure of enormous social and political influence, received in the offices of prime ministers and presidents, celebrated as a self-made immigrant success story, a testament to what Canada offered to those who arrived with nothing and worked hard. He had arrived with nothing. He had worked hard. Both of those things were true. But the story of what happened in between, the specific mechanisms by which nothing became everything, that story had been carefully managed, carefully framed, and in several key places, carefully obscured. The Bronfman family's wealth, as it exists today, is legitimate. The businesses are real. The philanthropy is real. The civic contributions are real. But the foundation on which all of it was built, the initial capital accumulation that made everything else possible, came from a decade of operating in conditions that, for anyone without the Bronfman's particular combination of audacity and political protection, would have ended in ruin or prosecution. That is not unique to the Bronfmans. It is, in fact, a pattern. Look at the history of almost any major Canadian fortune, and you find somewhere in the early chapters a moment of unexplained acceleration, a moment where the official narrative, the bootstrap story, the immigrant made good story, the small-town boy who worked his way up story, suddenly fails to account for the arithmetic. The numbers do not add up. The timeline does not make sense. Something happened, something that the family's preferred account of itself does not quite explain, and then the money was there, and the dynasty began, and within a generation or two, the origin story had been polished smooth and framed and hung on the wall of the family foundation's lobby. The Thompson family story is different in its texture from the Molsons or the Bronfmans. It does not involve Freemason networks or prohibition bootlegging. It involves something quieter and in some ways more interesting. It involves the relationship between information and power. And it begins in a barbershop. Roy Thompson was born in Toronto in 1894. His father was a barber, not a wealthy barber, not a barber who had built up significant savings, but an ordinary working-class barber whose shop was in a modest neighborhood and whose income was modest. Roy Thompson left school at 14 to help support the family. He worked as a farm laborer. He worked as a traveling salesman. He had, by the time he was in his late 20s, accumulated a record of commercial failure that was nearly comprehensive. He had tried selling farm equipment and failed. He had tried selling candy and failed. He had tried a number of other ventures that had not worked out. And then, in 1931, Roy Thompson bought a radio station in North Bay, Ontario. He bought it at a moment when the Great Depression was destroying businesses across Canada. He bought it with money that he raised partly through his own savings, which were not substantial, and partly through a combination of loans and arrangements whose specific details have never been entirely transparent. The radio station was CFCH, and it was struggling, and Thompson bought it and turned it around not through any particularly mysterious means, but through genuine commercial acumen, a sharp understanding of local advertising markets, and a willingness to work with an intensity that his competitors found difficult to match. That part of the story is straightforward. What is less straightforward is what happened next. Thompson expanded from North Bay to Timmins to other small northern Ontario communities. Each acquisition followed the same pattern. A struggling local media outlet, purchased cheaply, turned profitable through aggressive local advertising sales, used as the base for the next acquisition. The strategy was sensible and it was working. But it was working at a pace and generating capital at a scale that began by the late 1930s to attract attention from people in higher places. The specific relationship that changed Roy Thompson's life is one that historians have documented but rarely analyzed with much depth. In 1944, Thompson met John Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker was at that point a conservative member of Parliament from Saskatchewan, not yet the future prime minister he would become, but already a significant figure in the party and a man with extensive connections throughout the network of small city and regional institutions that made up the practical architecture of Canadian political life. Thompson and Diefenbaker became close. The nature and specifics of that closeness are a matter of record in general terms, but the specific conversations that took place, the specific understandings that were reached, those are not documented in any source that the public has access to. What is documented is the result. In 1953, Thompson was awarded the license to operate a television station in Edinburgh, Scotland, Scottish Television. This was not a Canadian story yet, but it became one because what Thompson received in Scotland was not simply a broadcast license. He received, in his own words, later quoted extensively, a license to print money. The phrase has become famous. What he meant was that a television license in a major market in 1953 was, for practical purposes, a monopoly. There was no competition, there was no alternative. Anyone who wanted to advertise to the television audience in central Scotland had to come to Roy Thompson, and they did. And the money flowed in a volume that was qualitatively different from anything the small-town Canadian radio business had produced. Thompson used the Scottish television profits to buy newspapers, dozens of them, then hundreds. He bought the Scotsman in Edinburgh. He bought the Sunday Times in London. He assembled, over the following 2 decades, one of the largest media empires in the English-speaking world, an empire that eventually passed to his son Kenneth, and then to his grandson David, who is today one of the wealthiest people on earth. The Thompson family's wealth is now estimated at somewhere between $50 and $70 billion, depending on the measurement. The empire includes not just legacy media assets, but Reuters, the global news agency, and Westlaw, the legal research service, among many others. The family's media holdings give them, in a very direct and practical sense, a degree of influence over how information is gathered, processed, and distributed globally that is difficult to fully articulate. Here's the question that the official Thompson story tends to leave unasked. How does a barber's son from Toronto end up with a television license in Scotland? The path runs through Diefenbaker and through other political connections that Thompson accumulated with considerable deliberateness throughout the 1940s. It runs through a set of relationships between the British conservative establishment and Canadian business interests that were, in the early 1950s, being actively managed by a small group of people who understood that the post-war media landscape was going to be enormously valuable and who were making decisions about who would benefit from it. Thompson was smart enough to see the opportunity and well-connected enough to be in the room when the opportunity was being allocated. But the opportunity itself, the specific license, the specific monopoly, that was not something he earned through commercial excellence in the way the story is usually told. That was something he received because of who he knew and what those people owed him or wanted from him. The Thompson family today is Canadian in the sense that they maintain residences in Canada and that the family foundation makes significant donations to Canadian institutions. But the fortune is global, the operations are global, and the specific mechanism that made the fortune possible, a regulatory gift dispensed by a British government to a man with the right political connections at the right moment in history, was not something that had very much to do with the hard work and commercial genius of the official story. There is a city in the middle of Canada, in the province of Quebec, that functions as the financial capital of the country in ways that most Canadians from other parts of the country do not fully appreciate. Montreal is that city, and the specific building that houses the most concentrated private power in Canadian financial history is a tower on de Maisonneuve Boulevard that contains the offices of Power Corporation of Canada. Power Corporation is not a name that most Canadians under 40 recognize. It does not sell consumer products. It does not have a retail presence. It does not advertise. It is an investment holding company, which is the most unglamorous possible description of one of the most consequential institutions in the country. Through a chain of subsidiaries and affiliated companies, Power Corporation and its associated entities control insurance companies, asset management firms, media companies, real estate holdings, and a network of political and institutional relationships that has been shaping Canadian public life for the better part of 60 years. And at the center of it, for most of those 60 years, was a man whose family origins were, in the most direct sense of the word, obscure. Paul Desmarais was born in 1927 in Sudbury, Ontario. His grandfather had come from Quebec and established a small business, and his father had continued that business, and Paul himself had grown up in circumstances that were solidly working class by any measure. He studied commerce at the University of Ottawa and then returned to Sudbury to take over what was left of the family business, which at that point was a single bus route connecting Sudbury to a nearby community, a bus route that was losing money, a bus route that the family was contemplating selling. Instead, Desmarais turned it around. He did it through aggressive cost cutting, through finding efficiencies that his predecessors had not bothered to look for, through a quality of focused commercial attention that was, by all accounts, genuinely impressive. Then he bought another bus company, then another. Then he bought a controlling interest in a larger transportation company. And then, in a move that no one at the time fully understood, he bought into a Quebec media company, and from there into a trust company, and from there into what eventually became Power Corporation. The speed of this expansion, from a single failing bus route in Sudbury to control of one of the largest private financial institutions in Canada, took approximately 15 years, from the late 1950s to the early 1970s. And the arithmetic of how it happened, how a young man with a failing bus route accumulated the capital and the influence to make the acquisitions he made at the pace he made them, has never been fully explained by any public account. The explanation that Desmarais' admirers offer is that he was simply brilliant, a financial genius with an intuitive understanding of corporate structure and a ferocious appetite for work. Both of those things were true, but financial brilliance and hard work do not by themselves explain access to capital. They do not explain why banks lent money to a young man from Sudbury at a scale that they were not lending to other young men with comparable track records. They do not explain why the Quebec establishment, a closed and insular world that was, in the 1960s, in the middle of the social upheaval of the Quiet Revolution, opened its doors to an Anglophone from Northern Ontario. What does explain it, at least in part, is a set of relationships that Desmarais cultivated with extraordinary intentionality throughout this period. He cultivated relationships with the Quebec financial establishment, including figures associated with the old French-Canadian business elite. He cultivated relationships with the Federal Liberal Party, which was, throughout most of this period, the party of power in Ottawa. He developed personal friendships with men who would become prime ministers, cabinet ministers, senior officials in the regulatory agencies that oversaw the financial sector. These relationships were not simply social, they were commercial and political in ways that created specific advantages. When Power Corporation wanted regulatory approvals, the approvals came. When Power Corporation wanted to acquire assets that were nominally subject to regulatory review, the review process moved smoothly. When Power Corporation needed access to capital markets at favorable rates, the access was available. None of this was illegal in any straightforward sense. It was rather the operation of a system in which political and commercial relationships created advantages that were invisible to outsiders, but entirely apparent to those inside the network. It was the way that Canadian capitalism had always worked, at the highest levels. The people who benefited from it had not designed the system. They had simply been smart enough and connected enough to use it. Desmarais used it with a consistency and effectiveness that made him, by the time of his death in 2013, the most powerful private individual in Canadian history. His family today controls a fortune estimated at over $10 billion. His sons and their associates continue to sit on the boards of the institutions that are making the significant decisions about the Canadian economy. His former political associates have included multiple prime ministers of Canada, finance ministers, foreign ministers, and a remarkable proportion of the senior officials at virtually every federal agency and crown corporation in the country. The relationship between Power Corporation and the Liberal Party of Canada, specifically, has been so consistent and so deep over so many decades that it has become one of the most discussed and least investigated features of Canadian political life. Jean Chrétien, who served as Prime Minister from 1993 to 2003, had family ties to the Desmarais family. His daughter France married Paul Desmarais' son André. Paul Martin, who served as Prime Minister from 2003 to 2006, was a former executive of Power Corporation. Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister, has known the Desmarais family his entire life. None of this is secret. All of it is documented. The question of whether this particular constellation of relationships has, over the course of 60 years, produced policy outcomes that specifically benefited the Desmarais family and their associated interests at the expense of other Canadians, that question has been asked by investigative journalists and researchers and opposition politicians, and has produced responses ranging from polite dismissal to aggressive legal threats. The Desmarais family, like the Molsons and the Bronfmans before them, emerged from obscurity into enormous power and wealth in a way that the official story does not quite fully account for. The official story is of a genius from Sudbury who worked harder and thought more clearly than everyone around him. That story is not false, but it is incomplete. The part that is missing is the system that was waiting for someone like Desmarais, that rewarded exactly the combination of qualities he possessed, that opened precisely because he understood how to open it, and that, once opened, never closed behind him. There is a province in eastern Canada that functions in the popular imagination of the rest of the country as a kind of afterthought. New Brunswick is not the smallest province in Canada, but it sometimes feels like it, because it sits in a corner of the country that the major population centers tend to regard with a mixture of affection and benign neglect. The people of New Brunswick have a reputation for toughness and for self-sufficiency, and for a kind of wry acceptance of the fact that their province has always been governed, in the economic sense, by forces that originate elsewhere. Except that is not entirely true, because New Brunswick has been governed, in the economic sense, for most of its history by a single family, a family that does not originate elsewhere at all, a family that is so deeply embedded in the physical and commercial landscape of the province that distinguishing between the family and the province is, in certain contexts, almost impossible. The Irving family is the closest thing Canada has ever had to a feudal dynasty. Kenneth Colin Irving, known as KC, was born in 1899 in a small community called Bucktouche on the eastern shore of New Brunswick. His father operated a general store and a small mill, and KC grew up working in those businesses and developing, from a very early age, a particular quality of attention to the mechanics of commerce that would define his entire life. He was not educated beyond the local schools. He did not attend university. He did not have family connections to any of the major centers of Canadian capital or political influence. What he had was oil, or rather, what he had was gasoline. In 1924, at the age of 25, KC Irving opened a gas station in Bucktouche and began selling Ford automobiles. The automobile business in the 1920s was still young enough that early entrants could establish positions of significant local dominance simply by moving faster than competitors and building customer loyalty before the market had consolidated. Irving did this with a thoroughness that was, from the beginning, something different from ordinary commercial ambition. He did not simply sell gas. He secured distribution rights. He moved up the supply chain. He established an oil refinery. He acquired the assets of competitors rather than simply outcompeting them in the market. He used each position he acquired as the basis for acquiring the next. And he moved with a consistency of purpose over decades that resulted in a commercial empire of extraordinary breadth. By the time of his death in 1992, KC Irving had built a conglomerate that included oil refining and distribution, gas stations across the Maritimes, shipbuilding, pulp and paper mills controlling enormous tracts of New Brunswick forest, bus lines, truck lines, construction companies, food processing operations, and most of the newspapers in New Brunswick. He had also, along the way, established the kind of political relationships with successive provincial governments that made the regulatory environment of New Brunswick, for most of his operating life, essentially a managed landscape shaped to the requirements of his businesses. The Irving Empire today, operated by KC's sons and grandsons, generates revenues estimated at over $8 billion annually. The family is estimated to be worth somewhere between $10 and $15 billion. They're among the wealthiest families in Canada and among the wealthiest in North America. And they operate still from Moncton and St. John and the towns of Coastal to New Brunswick in a way that makes the family and the province functionally inseparable. The part of the Irving story that tends to get the most attention in critical accounts is the media concentration. At various points in the 20th century, the Irving family has owned every English-language newspaper in the province of New Brunswick simultaneously. Everyone. A situation that is, from the perspective of democratic accountability and press freedom, genuinely extraordinary, when the single most powerful economic entity in a province also controls every newspaper that covers that province. The relationship between commercial power and information becomes, to put it gently, complicated. But the media concentration is actually the least interesting part of the Irving story, from the perspective of the questions we are asking tonight. The media concentration is a deliberate accumulation, visible and documented, that makes a certain kind of power explicit. What is more interesting is the nature of the original position. KC Irving arrived at his opportunity in 1924 as a 25-year-old with a gas station and a Ford dealership. The opportunity that he was arriving at specifically was the opportunity created by the particular geography of New Brunswick. New Brunswick in 1924 was a province where the automobile was transforming the economy and where the infrastructure for supplying that automobile, the gas stations, the garages, the distribution networks, was still largely uncreated. The person who could establish that infrastructure first, in a province of modest size and manageable geography, would have a position that would be very difficult to dislodge. Irving saw this. He moved faster than anyone else to create the infrastructure, and then he protected it. The protection came in part from his extraordinary personal qualities, his energy, his attention to detail, his refusal to delegate matters of strategic importance, his famous insistence on maintaining direct control of every aspect of every business he operated. But it came also from the political relationships he cultivated with every successive government of New Brunswick, relationships that ensured that his competitors never received the kind of regulatory accommodation that his own businesses received, that zoning decisions and procurement contracts and environmental approvals moved in ways that were favorable to his interests. Irving moved to Bermuda in 1971, citing tax reasons. He lived there for the rest of his life. He continued to run his New Brunswick empire from Bermuda, visiting regularly, making all significant decisions personally, maintaining the relationships that made the empire possible. When he died in 1992, his body was brought back to New Brunswick for burial. The province mourned him as it might have mourned a founding father. His sons Arthur, Jack, and James divided the various components of the empire and continued operating them with the same focused intensity that KC had brought. The family has maintained, deliberately and consistently, a policy of minimal public disclosure, minimal media engagement, and maximal legal aggression toward anyone who attempts to investigate its affairs in ways that the family considers inappropriate. There is a word that New Brunswickers use, sometimes with pride and sometimes with a weariness that is hard to separate from pride, when they describe their relationship to the Irvings. They say the province is Irving country, not like a metaphor, like a statement of geographical fact. The trees in the forests of New Brunswick are Irving trees. The gas in the tanks of the cars on the roads is Irving gas. The building materials in the houses were probably processed at an Irving mill. The news that people read in the morning was written and printed by people on the Irving payroll. This is not a situation that arose from conspiracy. It arose from the consistent and deliberate accumulation of commercial and political advantage over the course of nearly a century, by a family that understood with extraordinary clarity what it was building and what it would take to protect what they had built. But it began, at its foundation, with a 25-year-old and a gas station in a small town that most Canadians have never heard of. And the distance between that starting point and the outcome, the distance that a single human lifetime of commercial activity traveled, remains, when you contemplate it in full, one of the most remarkable journeys in the history of Canadian capitalism. The province that K.C. Irving came from had its own history before him, a history that goes back to the Acadian deportation of 1755, when the British colonial government expelled approximately 11,000 French-speaking Acadian settlers from what is now Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, forcibly removing a population that had been living in the region for generations, destroying their communities, scattering them across the Atlantic world. Some went to Louisiana, where their descendants became the Cajuns. Some went to France. Some died in transit. Some eventually came back. The land they left behind, the farms and communities of coastal New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, was redistributed. It went to new settlers, to New England planters, to loyalists who arrived after the American Revolution, to the network of British colonial administrators who were making decisions about who should receive what in the landscape of the newly organized British North American colonies. The redistribution was not clean. It was contested, confused, and in many cases conducted in ways that created legal ambiguities that persisted for generations. K.C. Irving's family had been in Bouctouche for several generations before him. The specific history of how the family came to be there, what land rights they held, and on what basis, is not something that the Irving family has ever made a point of discussing publicly. What is clear is that they were there, in a part of New Brunswick, where the Acadian presence was strong, where the memory of the deportation was not distant, and where the question of who had legitimate claim to what was not, in the 1920s, entirely settled. Irving built his empire on a landscape whose legal foundations were, in places, still contested. He did not create those contested foundations, but he operated within them, and in operating within them, he benefited from them, in the sense that the ambiguities in the system created opportunities for someone with the right qualities to establish positions that a cleaner, more settled legal landscape might not have permitted. This is a pattern, and it is a pattern that repeats. Go to any province of Canada, find the oldest and largest private fortunes, trace them back to their origins. You will find, almost invariably, that the initial position, the piece of land, or the commercial license, or the resource right that started the accumulation, rests on a foundation that involves some combination of colonial dispossession, regulatory advantage, and political relationship. The dispossession is usually of indigenous peoples, whose prior claim to the land was simply not recognized by the legal systems that the colonial governments established. The regulatory advantage is usually a license, or a monopoly, or an exemption from rules that applied to everyone else. The political relationship is usually an informal understanding, never written down, between the family and the men who had the authority to give or deny the specific advantages the family needed. None of this is peculiar to Canada. It is the history of capitalism in settler colonial societies everywhere. But Canada has a particular relationship to its own history. In this regard, a particular reluctance to examine the specific mechanisms by which its wealthiest families became wealthy that makes the pattern more visible in Canada than it might be elsewhere, simply because it has been left so thoroughly unexamined. Let us go to the East Coast, to Nova Scotia, and to a family whose name you know from the grocery store, even if you do not know the family. The Weston family is today associated primarily with the Loblaw Companies, which is the largest food retail chain in Canada, and with the George Weston Limited Bakery and food manufacturing empire that includes brands like Wonder Bread and various other household names in Canadian grocery stores. The family is also associated with the luxury retail chain Selfridges in the United Kingdom and Holt Renfrew in Canada. Galen Weston, the patriarch of the most recent generation of the family, was for many years the public face of the PC brand, appearing in television advertisements with a warmth and approachability that made the family seem almost friendly in the way that very wealthy families rarely are. But the Westons are not originally Canadian. They are originally English, and the specific history of how they came to dominate Canadian food retail is a story that involves a set of political and commercial relationships that span the Atlantic that were formed during a particular moment in British and Canadian history, and that have never been examined with the kind of detail they deserve. Willard Garfield Weston, known as Garfield, was born in Toronto in 1898. His father, George Weston, had built a successful biscuit manufacturing business in Toronto, and Garfield grew up in that business and became its central executive in the 1920s. The Weston biscuit business was successful, genuinely successful, and Garfield expanded it through acquisitions and through building a quality reputation in the Canadian market. Then, in 1933, at the depth of the Great Depression, Garfield Weston did something that seemed, by any ordinary commercial logic, irrational. He moved to England and began acquiring bakeries. The timing was extraordinary. England in 1933 was in the depths of an economic crisis. Businesses were failing everywhere. Capital was scarce. Credit was difficult to obtain. The food industry was particularly distressed because consumer spending had contracted sharply and competition for the remaining market was fierce. And yet Garfield Weston, a Canadian baker with a successful but not enormous business, arrived in England and began buying bakeries at a pace and on a scale that was simply not possible for a self-funded entrepreneur operating at the margins of his existing resources. Where did the money come from? The answer involves a set of relationships that Weston had developed during the 1920s with figures in British financial and political life, relationships that are documented in general terms, but whose specific details, the specific conversations, the specific commitments, the specific arrangements are not publicly available. What is documented is that Weston had, by the early 1930s, developed close relationships with figures associated with the British conservative establishment, including individuals with connections to the intelligence services. The 1930s were a decade of considerable anxiety in British political and intelligence circles about the stability of European democracy and about the potential for fascist movements to gain influence in Britain itself. There was, within these circles, a set of conversations about the importance of controlling key supply chains, food production included, to ensure that, in the event of social unrest or political instability, the essential infrastructure of the country remained in hands that were trusted. The Westons were trusted. They were Canadian, which meant they were outside the class structures that made British domestic business complicated in this period. They were Protestant and culturally conservative. They had no obvious connections to the radical movements that were worrying the intelligence establishments of the period. And Garfield Weston had demonstrated, through his management of the family's Canadian operations, that he was an excellent operator with no political ambitions of his own. The acquisitions in England moved forward with a speed and at a scale that implied, at minimum, access to capital and credit that was not available through ordinary commercial channels. By the end of the 1930s, Weston had assembled one of the largest bakery operations in the United Kingdom, a position that was, when the Second World War broke out and food supply became a matter of national security, enormously valuable and enormously strategic. During the war, the Weston bakery operations in Britain were integral to the national food distribution system. Garfield Weston himself served as a member of Parliament in the Canadian House of Commons during this period, commuting between London and Ottawa, a dual presence that gave him simultaneous access to the highest levels of government in both countries at the moment when those governments were most concerned about food security. The relationships he formed during the war, in both Ottawa and London, became the foundation for the post-war expansion of the family's Canadian operations. When Loblaw Companies, the grocery retail chain, became available for acquisition in the 1940s and 1950s, the Weston family was positioned to make the acquisitions in ways that its competitors were not. The regulatory approvals moved smoothly. The financing was available. The political relationships that the family had built during the war translated in the peacetime commercial environment into the kind of implicit support that made certain outcomes more likely and certain obstacles more manageable. The Weston family today is one of the wealthiest in Canada and one of the most prominent in Canadian retail and food manufacturing. Galen Weston's son, also named Galen, is the current chairman of the family's operations. The family maintains homes in Canada, England, and Ireland, and the fortune is globally diversified in ways that make any single national jurisdiction essentially irrelevant to its overall position. The Loblaw companies, which the family controls, operate in ways that have periodically attracted regulatory scrutiny. The bread price-fixing scandal, which became public in 2017 when Loblaw self-reported to the Competition Bureau, revealed that major Canadian bread producers, including brands in the Weston portfolio, had engaged in coordinated price fixing for approximately 14 years. The settlement involved a compensation program for affected consumers, but no senior executives were prosecuted. The family apologized, established the compensation fund, and the matter was, for official purposes, resolved. It was not the first time that the Weston operations had attracted attention for practices that raised questions about the relationship between market dominance and the legal constraints that are supposed to govern it. And it was not in the context of the family's long history with the specific kind of commercial and political advantage that we have been describing particularly surprising. Let us go further east, to the province where the landscape itself seems to carry the memory of older struggles, to the flat fields of New Brunswick and its neighbor Prince Edward Island, to the red clay soil and the cold Atlantic light, to a province where the potato is not simply a crop, but something close to an identity. The McCain family of Florenceville, New Brunswick, is not as well known outside the province as the Irvings, but within the global food industry, the name is as significant as almost any other in the world. McCain Foods, the company that Harrison and Wallace McCain founded in 1957 in the small village of Florenceville on the banks of the St. John River, became the largest producer of French fries in the world. At its peak, roughly 1/3 of all the French fries consumed on Earth came from a McCain facility. The company operates in 30 countries, with 57 manufacturing facilities, and generates revenues of approximately $10 billion annually. Harrison McCain was born in 1927. His father was a potato farmer and businessman who had built a moderately successful agricultural enterprise in the St. John River Valley, which is some of the finest potato-growing land in North America. The McCains were not poor. They were solid, established New Brunswick family, comfortably situated by local standards, with good land and community standing. But they were not, by any recognizable measure, positioned to build a global food empire. The story of how they did it begins with a conversation in 1956, when Harrison and his brother Wallace decided that the frozen food industry, which was just beginning its post-war expansion, represented an opportunity. The specific opportunity they saw was in frozen French fries, a product that was becoming important to the emerging fast food industry in the United States, and that required a consistent supply of a specific quality of processed potato at an industrial scale. They needed a factory. They needed equipment. They needed capital. The capital came, initially, from a combination of family savings, local investment, and a loan from the Bank of Montreal that was, by all accounts, larger than the bank's local managers would ordinarily have been comfortable providing to a startup with no operating history. The bank loan moved through. The factory was built. The company launched in 1957 and almost immediately began generating revenues that confirmed the brothers' instinct about the market. What made the McCain operation work was a combination of genuine factors. The St. John River Valley's soil and climate produced potatoes of a quality and consistency that was well suited to industrial processing. The brothers were extraordinarily capable operators who brought a focused intensity to every aspect of the business. The timing was excellent. The fast food industry was expanding rapidly in the 1950s and 1960s, and McDonald's and the other major chains needed large, reliable suppliers who could maintain consistent quality at scale. But timing and location and capability, while necessary, were not sufficient to explain the specific speed of the McCain expansion. Within a decade of founding, the company had not only dominated the Canadian market, but had established operations in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, and in Australia. The international expansion required capital, and it required the kind of relationships with government agencies and foreign investors that were not available to most small-town manufacturers in the 1960s. The McCains had those relationships. They had them in part through the network of New Brunswick political connections that had served the province's business establishment for generations, a network in which the Irving family was also deeply embedded, and in which the McCains, as a substantial agricultural and commercial family, had their own standing. But they also had relationships that extended beyond New Brunswick into the broader Canadian corporate network, through banks and law firms and the professional services that connected the major commercial families of the country in ways that were not visible to outsiders, but that functioned as an essential infrastructure for anyone operating at scale. Harrison McCain in particular was known for his political intelligence, his ability to navigate the regulatory and governmental landscape in every jurisdiction where the company operated. In Canada, this meant relationships with federal agricultural agencies, with provincial governments, with the crown corporations that managed aspects of the food and agricultural economy. In the United Kingdom, it meant developing relationships with the regulatory bodies that governed food manufacturing and with the political figures who influenced them. The McCain family story is, in its broad outlines, one of the most straightforwardly successful stories in Canadian business history. The brothers worked extraordinarily hard. They made good decisions. They built something real and durable. But the specific foundation on which they built it, the land, the initial capital, the political relationships, the access to regulatory systems that moved in their favor, that foundation had a history that preceded them and that they inherited in the way that established regional families inherit such things from a long chain of prior arrangements. The land where the McCain family's potato operations were centered had been worked by Acadian farmers before the deportation of 1755. The redistribution of that land, the specific grants and titles by which it passed into the hands of the families who held it in the 19th and 20th centuries, is a history that, like the Irving history, has never been the subject of sustained public examination. The McCains did not dispossess the Acadians. That happened more than a century before the family built their first factory. But they built on land whose most recent prior history, the history of how it moved from Acadian farmsteads to the holdings of Protestant Anglophone families in the post-deportation reorganization of maritime agricultural land, is a history of displacement and redistribution that shaped the landscape into which the McCains were born. This is not a condemnation of the McCains. It is an observation about the relationship between history and fortune. The McCains made extraordinary use of what they had, but what they had, specifically, the land, the community standing, the regional network, the agricultural expertise that had been built up over generations, that was the product of a prior history whose details are more complicated than the official story of the farm boy who built a global empire tends to acknowledge. And now let us move to the westernmost part of the country, to British Columbia, to a province that has always had a particular relationship with the mythology of the self-made man, the frontier businessman, the person who arrived with nothing and built an empire from the raw materials of the West. James Pattison was born in Luseland, Saskatchewan in 1928, and he embodies more completely than almost anyone else in Canadian business history the qualities that we associate with that mythology. He arrived in Vancouver in the 1950s, worked his way through the car business, acquired his first dealership, and then began accumulating businesses across an extraordinary range of industries: car dealerships, food distribution, media, outdoor advertising, resorts, marketing, entertainment, agricultural products. The Jim Pattison Group today is the largest privately held company in Canada, with revenues of over $14 billion annually and operations in 80 countries. Jim Pattison himself is in his 90s and is still, by all accounts, actively involved in the management of the company. He is celebrated as one of the great entrepreneurs of Canadian history, a man who built his empire entirely through commercial genius and relentless work. And he did work relentlessly. That is documented, attested to by hundreds of people who worked with him and observed him over decades. His commercial instincts are, by any measure, extraordinary. The diversity of industries he has operated in successfully is almost without precedent in Canadian business. He is, in the most genuine sense, a remarkable businessman. But the Pattison Group's growth did not happen in a vacuum. The specific moment in Vancouver's commercial history when Pattison was making his most significant acquisitions was a moment of particular opportunity for someone with the right relationships. The Expo, 86 World's Fair, which Vancouver hosted, was organized with Jimmy Pattison as its chairman. That appointment, made by the provincial government, put him at the center of a real estate and development process that transformed large sections of Vancouver's waterfront and inner city, processes that created enormous commercial opportunities for businesses and individuals who were positioned to benefit from the development. Pattison was positioned. The specific ways in which his various businesses benefited from the Expo 86 process, from the regulatory decisions and the land transactions and the development approvals that surrounded it, have been documented in general terms by journalists and researchers, but the specific details of the most significant arrangements remain, like the specific details of so many of the stories we are telling tonight, not fully publicly available. What is publicly available is the outcome. The Jim Pattison Group emerged from the Expo 86 era as a significantly larger and more diversified enterprise than it had been before. The family's wealth grew substantially during this period. The political relationships that Pattison cultivated through the Expo 86 chairmanship became part of the foundation of subsequent business arrangements that extended across multiple governments and multiple decades. Pattison's relationship with the British Columbia government, under both social credit and subsequent administrations, has been one of the constants of his business career. He is not associated with any particular party in the way that some businessmen are. He is associated rather with power itself, with the practice of maintaining productive relationships with whoever holds power in any given moment, and of ensuring that those relationships translate into the kind of commercial advantage that turns a car dealership into a $14 billion conglomerate. There is a cheese in Canadian grocery stores that most Canadians eat without thinking about where it came from. It is on the pizza and in the pasta, and sliced thin at the deli counter and grated over the pasta at the Italian restaurant. The name on the wrapper says Saputo, and the story of how that name came to be on that wrapper in Canada in 1954 begins in circumstances that are considerably more complicated than the official story tends to suggest. Lino Saputo was born in 1932 in the village of Monreale in Sicily. His family were cheesemakers, as Italian families had been making cheese in the same villages and with the same methods for centuries. In 1952, Leno and his family immigrated to Montreal as part of the post-war wave of Southern European immigration that was transforming the demographics of Canadian cities. Lino's father, Giuseppe, brought with him the knowledge and the equipment to make cheese in the traditional Sicilian style. In 1954, with capital that the family describes as savings and small loans from the Italian community in Montreal, Lino Saputo founded Fromagerie Saputo, a small operation producing cheese for the Italian immigrant community in Montreal's East End. The business grew. The products were good, and the Italian immigrant community was large and hungry for the tastes of home. Montreal in the 1950s and 1960s was one of the most dynamic immigrant communities in North America, with a Sicilian and Italian presence that had deep roots in the commercial and social life of the city. The Saputo family became part of that community, and the community supported the family's business. But the growth of Saputo from a small East Montreal cheese producer to one of the largest dairy companies in the world, a company with revenues of over $14 billion, operations in 14 countries, and a market capitalization that has made the family among the wealthiest in Canada, that growth does not follow simply from good cheese and community loyalty. Montreal in the 1950s and 1960s had a particular quality. It was a city where certain kinds of commerce, particularly commerce involving food distribution, operated within a parallel system of relationships that was not simply the formal commercial system of contracts and regulations. The Sicilian immigrant community in Montreal had brought with it certain organizational traditions that were familiar from their region of origin, traditions that involved the management of commercial relationships through networks of mutual obligation, mutual protection, and mutual benefit that operated alongside, but not necessarily within, the formal legal and commercial system. The relationship between the Saputo family and these organizational traditions is a subject that has been raised by journalists and researchers and law enforcement agencies at various points over the decades, and that has never been definitively resolved in the public record. The family has consistently and firmly denied any improper associations. The company itself, as a publicly traded entity, has been subject to regulatory oversight and has maintained the kind of compliance record that is expected of a major public corporation. But the early history of the cheese business in Montreal, specifically the distribution arrangements that allowed a small producer to establish and maintain market access in a city where distribution networks were controlled by entities that were, in several documented cases, connected to organized crime, is a history that has never been fully examined in public. What is documented is that Saputo grew. It grew through acquisitions, many of them at prices that, when examined, reflected advantageous terms for the buyer. It grew through expansions of its distribution network that happened with a smoothness that was not typical for small producers trying to break into established markets. It grew through a series of relationships with retail chains and food service distributors that positioned the Saputo brand with a prominence that its relatively modest marketing expenditure did not entirely explain. And then, in 1997, Saputo went public. The initial public offering valued the company at approximately $700 million. The family retained control. The public offering provided capital for international expansion. Within 2 decades, the company had acquired dairy operations in the United States, Argentina, Australia, and the United Kingdom, and had grown to the scale we described. The Saputo family today is respected, philanthropic, and deeply embedded in the institutional life of Montreal. The Family Foundation is a significant donor to hospitals, universities, and cultural institutions. Lino Saputo, now in his 90s, is honored as a founding figure of Italian-Canadian business success. His son Emanuele has led the company through its period of greatest growth. None of what has made the Saputo company successful in recent decades is improper. The business is well managed, the products are genuine, the governance is appropriate for a public company. But the foundation, the specific circumstances of the early Montreal cheese business, the distribution arrangements, the community relationships, the particular way in which a small Sicilian family was able to establish a commercial position in a city with a complicated relationship between formal and informal commercial organization, that foundation has never been fully examined. It does not need to be examined to make the Saputo story interesting. The story is interesting because it is one version of a recurring Canadian pattern. A family arrives. The family has particular knowledge, particular community connections, particular access to informal networks. The formal commercial system and the informal relationship system intersect, and the family finds itself, within a generation or two, in a position that the formal commercial system alone would not have produced. Nobody questions the cheese. The questions that do not get asked about Canadian wealth are not generally about individual families. They are about a system. And the system has a history that is older than any of the families we have discussed tonight. It is a history that begins, if you want to locate it precisely, in the moment when Europeans first arrived on the eastern shores of North America and began the process of making the continent available for the kind of private accumulation that these families ultimately represent. That history involves the people who were here before, the people who are always, in these discussions, either absent or present only as a backdrop, a feature of the landscape rather than a party to the story. The land on which every Canadian fortune, including all of the ones we have described tonight, was ultimately built, is land that was occupied, managed, and in certain spiritual and legal traditions, owned by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The specific territories of the families we have discussed tonight, the river valleys of New Brunswick, the waterfront of Montreal, the forests of Ontario, the agricultural lands of the prairies, the coastal regions of British Columbia, all of these territories were, before colonization, part of complex indigenous economies that included trade, resource management, seasonal patterns of use, and governance systems that were as sophisticated as any in the world at the time of contact. Those economies and governance systems were not simply displaced by the arrival of Europeans. They were deliberately and systematically dismantled by a colonial project that combined military force, legal manipulation, disease, and the imposition of an alien framework of land ownership that redefined the territory as available for private acquisition. The land grants that gave colonial merchants access to the waterfront of Montreal, the timber rights that gave certain families control of the forests of New Brunswick, the agricultural land on which the families of the Maritimes built their enterprises, all of this was made available through a legal and administrative process that operated by simply not recognizing the prior claims of the people who had been using the land. This is not a secret. It is the foundational history of Canada. It is documented in the treaties, many of them broken, some of them never completed, that were supposed to formalize the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous nations. It is documented in the specific histories of specific territories, where the records of colonial land administration tell, if you read them carefully, the story of how a continent was made available for the accumulation of private wealth. The fortunes of Canada's wealthiest families rest at their ultimate foundation on this history, not through any personal wrongdoing of the current generation of those families, most of whom were born long after the foundational dispossessions had occurred, but through the accumulation of advantages compounded over generations that flow from a starting point that was itself the product of a particular history. The Molsons built their brewery on the Montreal waterfront because the Montreal waterfront had been made available for private commercial development through a colonial land system that had not recognized and would not recognize the prior occupation of the Haudenosaunee and the Kanien'kehá:ka peoples, whose territory it was. The Irvings built their empire in New Brunswick on land that had been reorganized through the deportation of the Acadians, and before that through the dispossession of the Mi'kmaq people, who had lived in that territory for thousands of years before any Europeans set foot there. The Mackains built their potato empire in the St. John River Valley on land that was Mi'kmaq territory, on soil that Acadian farmers had cleared, that had been redistributed after the deportation to the Protestant Anglophone families who became the agricultural establishment of the region. The Pattersons built their empire in British Columbia on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, territories that were never subject to a comprehensive treaty, territories where the question of indigenous title has never been legally resolved. None of the wealth we have been discussing tonight would exist without this prior history. The specific mechanisms, the licenses, the political relationships, the regulatory advantages, all of those came later. They are the second chapter of the story, the chapter that explains how the initial position became a dynasty. But the initial position, the availability of the land and the resources and the commercial infrastructure for private development at all, that is the first chapter. And the first chapter begins not in a barber shop in Toronto or a gas station in Bouctouche or a brewery on the St. Lawrence, but in the specific political decisions made by European colonial governments over the course of 3 centuries to make a continent available for exactly this kind of accumulation. There is a woman named Belinda Stronach who, in the early 2000s, was briefly a candidate for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada. She was attractive, she was articulate, and she was the daughter of one of the most powerful men in Canadian manufacturing. But beyond her father's name, when people tried to pin down what she had done, what she had built on her own, the answer was complicated. Because what Frank Stronach built, the empire that produced his daughter's fortune and his own, is one of the most genuinely mysterious origin stories in Canadian business history. Frank Stronach was born Franz Strossack in 1932 in Klein-Semmering, Austria. He trained as a tool and die maker, a skilled trade in the precision manufacturing industry. In 1954, at the age of 22, he immigrated to Canada. He worked in Toronto as a machinist. He saved money. In 1957, with a handful of employees working in a small garage in Toronto, he founded a tool and die shop called Multimatic. The official story from that point is one of continuous organic growth, driven by Stronach's technical genius and entrepreneurial vision. The shop grew. It won contracts from the automotive industry. It expanded its capabilities. It acquired other companies. By the 1970s, it had become Magna International, and by the 1980s and 1990s, Magna had become one of the largest auto parts manufacturers in the world, with revenues in the tens of billions and operations across multiple continents. Stronach is today estimated to be worth somewhere between $1 billion and several $billion, depending on the accounting, and is described universally as one of the great entrepreneurial success stories in Canadian history. The tool and die business in Toronto in the 1950s was a genuine industry with genuine demand from the rapidly expanding North American automotive sector. Stronach's technical skills were real. His ability to understand what automotive manufacturers needed and to provide it at the right quality and price was genuine. The foundational story, the skilled immigrant who identifies a market need and builds a business to serve it, that story is accurate. But the specific acceleration of the Magna story, the speed with which Stronach was able to move from a small tool and die shop to one of the largest automotive suppliers in the world, involves a set of factors that the official story tends to undersell. The most significant of these factors is Stronach's political intelligence. From a very early stage in his business career, Stronach developed relationships with figures in Canadian political life, particularly in the Ontario provincial government, that were, in several documented cases, valuable in specific commercial ways. He was also, from early on, deeply engaged with the financial community in Toronto, with the banks and investment dealers and accounting firms that provided the capital and the advisory services that made large-scale acquisition activity possible, the specific financial structures through which Magna grew, the deal structures, the acquisition terms, the ways in which Stronach's personal compensation was arranged relative to the returns available to external shareholders, have been subjects of considerable controversy and have attracted more than one governance review and shareholder dispute. The arrangements through which Stronach retained control of Magna, while extracting what critics described as disproportionate personal compensation, were legal, but they were the kind of legal that depends entirely on the existence of particular governance arrangements and on the willingness of boards and institutional shareholders to accept those arrangements. The political dimension of the Stronach story reached its most explicit in the 2000s, when Stronach, by then in his 70s, became directly involved in Canadian federal politics. He had for years been a donor to both major political parties, a practice that reflected his understanding that productive political relationships required investment in both directions. But his daughter Belinda's political career, and subsequently his own direct political advocacy, brought the family's political relationships into a visibility that they had not previously had. Stronach moved back to Austria in later years and has pursued a range of projects there with a level of political engagement in European affairs that reflects the same qualities, the same understanding of the relationship between political access and commercial opportunity that drove his Canadian career. The Magna International story is, in its ultimate form, a genuine success story. The company employed hundreds of thousands of people and produced genuine economic value. But the path from a tool and die shop in a garage in Toronto to one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world involved not just commercial genius, but a set of political and financial relationships that are not fully captured in the bootstrap narrative. There is a detail in Stronach's history that does not appear in most accounts. His initial financing, the capital that allowed him to move from a very small operation to a medium-sized one, came in part from sources within the Austrian immigrant community in Toronto, a community that had its own organizational characteristics and its own networks of mutual obligation and commercial relationship that were, in the 1950s and 1960s, not fully visible to the broader Canadian commercial establishment. The Austrian immigrant community in post-war Toronto was a community that included, among others, individuals who had left Austria in the aftermath of the Second World War with assets and skills, and in some cases with the kinds of resources that were not always straightforwardly accounted for. The specific character of the financing that supported the early Magna operation and the specific nature of the community networks through which that financing was arranged is not something that has been the subject of any sustained public investigation. This is a common feature of immigrant business histories. The community networks through which early capital is mobilized, the specific arrangements and obligations that tie those networks together, the ways in which commercial relationships in immigrant communities intersect with social and cultural institutions that operate according to their own norms. All of this tends to be invisible to the official commercial record. The invisibility is not necessarily suspicious. Most of it reflects simply the normal operation of trust-based communities, of people who know each other and rely on each other and make commercial arrangements based on relationships rather than formal documentation. But occasionally, in the specific cases where the amounts involved are large enough and the specific sources of the capital are obscure enough, the invisibility becomes something more interesting. Stronach's origin story, the tool and die maker from Austria who arrived with skills and ambition and built an empire, is a story that Canadians find genuinely appealing because it confirms the mythology of Canada as a country of opportunity, a country where the right combination of talent and work produces the right results. That mythology is not without truth. Stronach was talented and he worked. But the specific result that his talent and work produced, the specific scale and shape of the Magna Empire, required more than talent and work. It required a particular kind of access, a particular kind of relationship, a particular kind of early support that the official story leaves in the background. Let us consider for a moment the deeper patterns that connect all of these stories. The Molsons, the Bronfmans, the Thompsons, the Desmarais family, the Irvings, the Westons, the McCains, the Pattisons, the Saputos, the Stronachs. These are families from different parts of Canada, different ethnic backgrounds, different industries, different eras. They are connected by very little that is obvious, and yet when you examine their stories carefully, certain patterns emerge with a consistency that is remarkable. The first pattern is what we might call the unexplained acceleration. In virtually every case, there is a moment in the early history of the family fortune where the arithmetic stops working, where the resources available at the beginning of a period do not plausibly account for the position achieved by the end of it. The gap between input and output is filled in each case by something that the official story describes in general terms, but does not specifically document. The second pattern is the political relationship. In virtually every case, the establishment and maintenance of the family's commercial position has involved a set of relationships with political power that went beyond ordinary lobbying or electoral donations, that involved a degree of mutual dependence between the commercial interests of the family and the political interests of the individuals and institutions they were connected to. These relationships are rarely documented in any explicit way, but their effects are visible in the regulatory outcomes, the procurement decisions, the licensing arrangements, the land grants, and commercial licenses that the families received at crucial moments. The third pattern is the obscured foundation. In virtually every case, the land or the resource or the commercial position that formed the foundation of the family's initial accumulation was itself the product of a prior history that has not been fully examined. In some cases, that prior history involves indigenous dispossession. In some cases, it involves the specific commercial and political arrangements of the colonial period. In some cases, it involves the informal networks of immigrant communities operating at the margins of the formal system. In every case, the foundation is more complicated than the official story acknowledges. The fourth pattern is the transformation of origin. Once the initial accumulation is established, the family works, consciously or not, to transform its origins into something that fits the mythology of legitimate success. The bootlegger becomes the distillery owner. The political insider becomes the self-made entrepreneur. The beneficiary of colonial land grants becomes the pioneer who tamed the wilderness. The transformation is not dishonest in any simple sense, because by the time it is accomplished, the businesses are real, the employment is real, the philanthropy is real. But it is selective. It emphasizes the qualities and efforts that produce success, while leaving in shadow the circumstances that made those qualities and efforts productive. The fifth pattern is the silence around the questions, the specific questions that would, if asked and pursued, produce the most uncomfortable answers. The questions about specific sources of initial capital, about specific regulatory decisions and who made them and why, about the specific terms of the political relationships that the families cultivated and what was exchanged. Those questions are not asked, not because anyone is actively preventing them from being asked, but because the system has developed, over generations, a set of norms about what kinds of questions about wealth and power are appropriate and what kinds are not. And the questions we're asking tonight fall, for the most part, in the category of not appropriate. This is not a Canadian phenomenon. The same patterns appear in the histories of wealthy families in every country that went through a period of colonial development, followed by industrial capitalism. The Boston Brahmin families of New England, the plantation families of the American South, the industrial dynasties of Britain, the commercial families of Argentina and Australia and South Africa. All of them have origin stories that, examined carefully, reveal the same combination of genuine capability, advantageous timing, political relationship, and obscured foundation. What makes Canada interesting is not that the pattern exists here, but the specific ways in which the Canadian version of the pattern has been managed. Canada has a particular self-image as a fair, orderly, well-regulated society, a place where the rules apply equally to everyone and where success is earned rather than arranged. That self-image makes the questions we are asking tonight feel, to many Canadians, somehow unpatriotic or inappropriate, as if examining the specific mechanisms of wealth accumulation were an attack on the country itself, rather than an examination of the gap between the country's self-image and its actual history. But the self-image is not the country. The self-image is a choice. It is a choice to emphasize certain things and to leave other things in shadow. It is a choice that every generation makes about which stories to tell about itself and which stories to leave untold. There is something that the conventional histories of these families share, something beyond the patterns we have been describing. They all, to varying degrees, involve a relationship with time that is unusual. These are not stories of people who accumulated money in their own generation and spent it. These are stories of dynasties, multi-generational structures of wealth and influence that persist and compound across time in ways that are qualitatively different from individual success. The Molson fortune has persisted for over 200 years, the Thompson fortune for nearly a century, the Irving fortune for nearly a century, the Desmarais fortune for 60 years. When wealth persists across that many generations, it is no longer simply the product of the individuals who created it. It is the product of institutions, legal, financial, political, and cultural institutions that have been developed over time specifically to protect and perpetuate it. The legal institutions are the most straightforward: holding companies, trusts, foundations, voting share structures that separate economic ownership from corporate control. All of these are tools that wealthy families use to maintain their position across generations in ways that reduce or eliminate the possibility that any single generation's bad decisions could dissipate the fortune. The Molsons used a holding company structure. The Thompsons used a trust structure. The Irvings use a combination of corporate structures that are deliberately opaque. These structures are legal. They are used by wealthy families everywhere, but their effect, over time, is to make the accumulation of fortune not just possible, but self-reinforcing. The wealth protects itself. The financial institutions are equally important. The banks that lend to wealthy families, the investment dealers who manage their assets, the accountants who structure their affairs, the lawyers who defend their interests. All of these professionals develop, over time, a deep familiarity with the family situation and a deep personal and institutional interest in the continuation of the relationship. The result is a set of services available to established wealthy families that is qualitatively better in terms of sophistication and responsiveness than the services available to anyone trying to enter the same commercial space from outside. The political institutions are perhaps the most interesting. The specific ways in which Canada's political institutions at the federal and provincial levels have been shaped over time by the interests of its wealthiest families are documented in the academic literature on Canadian political economy and are well understood by those who study such things. The relationship between corporate concentration and regulatory capture, between wealth and the specific content of tax policy, between commercial media ownership and the limits of political debate. These are not conspiracy theories. They are features of the system that are visible to anyone who looks. What is less visible and more interesting is the cultural dimension. The wealthiest families in Canada have, over time, become embedded in the cultural institutions of the country in ways that make challenging them feel like challenging the country itself. The Molsons built the arena in Montreal. The Thompson family built media institutions that shaped Canadian journalism for decades. The Irving family built the institutions of civic life in New Brunswick. The Westons gave their name to hospitals and cultural centers. The McCains endowed chairs at universities. The Saputos sponsored cultural events. The Pattisons gave buildings to hospitals and universities. Philanthropy is real. The contributions that these families have made to Canadian public life are not fake, but philanthropy also performs a function that goes beyond altruism. It creates a sense of social contract between the wealthy family and the community it operates in. It creates a set of relationships with universities, hospitals, cultural institutions that provide both soft, reputational protection and hard practical access. The institution that bears your name, whose endowment you fund, whose board you sit on, is an institution that will not be publicly critical of your business practices. The hospital that you fund will name a wing after you and invite you to galas where you sit next to politicians and judges and the editors of newspapers that your advertising dollars support. This is not a conspiracy. It is a system that has evolved over generations to protect and perpetuate the position of those who have the resources to participate in it at the highest levels. And it is a system that is, in Canada, almost entirely invisible to public scrutiny, not because anyone is hiding it, but because the culture has developed a set of norms that make examining it feel inappropriate. The question that does not get asked is not any specific question about any specific family. The question that does not get asked is the systemic question. The question about why Canada, a country with the resources and the governance capacity to ensure a much more broadly distributed prosperity, has instead produced a landscape in which a handful of families control resources at a scale that bears no obvious relationship to the contributions those families have made to the society. That question is not asked because the families who would be most affected by the answer to it have over generations cultivated the political relationships, funded the cultural institutions, and operated within the media landscape in ways that ensure it is not asked, not through overt censorship, but through the much more effective mechanism of shaping what feels like an appropriate topic of conversation and what feels in polite Canadian company like a kind of rudeness. We have been rude tonight, and we are not done. There is a chapter of Canadian history that almost no one discusses, a chapter that connects the mysteries we have been examining to something even older and even less examined. It is the chapter that begins not with the Molsons or the Bronfmans or any of the families who became wealthy in the post-Confederation period, but with the original organization of the country's commercial landscape in the years immediately following European contact. Canada was not simply a wild continent that Europeans came to and civilized. It was a continent with an existing economy, an existing set of commercial relationships, an existing infrastructure of trade and resource management that had been built up over thousands of years by the peoples who lived there. That economy was complex. It involved long-distance trade networks that spanned the continent, carrying goods from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, from the Arctic to the Gulf of Mexico. It involved specialized production of goods that were in demand across wide geographic areas. It involved sophisticated systems of exchange and credit and mutual obligation that were, in function if not in form, equivalent to the commercial systems of any other complex society. When Europeans arrived and began trading with indigenous peoples, they did not bring commerce to a land without commerce. They inserted themselves into an existing commercial system and, over time, restructured that system to serve their own interests. The fur trade is the most discussed version of this story, but it is not the only version. The fisheries of the Grand Banks, the timber trade of the eastern forests, the agricultural development of the river valleys, all of these were processes through which existing indigenous relationships with the land and its resources were reorganized to produce wealth for European commercial interests. The reorganization was not completed overnight. It took centuries, and throughout those centuries there were specific moments, specific transactions, specific decisions about who would receive what rights and on what terms that determined who would ultimately benefit from the reorganization and who would not. Some of those specific moments involve the direct ancestors of the families we have been discussing tonight. The colonial land grants that gave specific families access to specific resources. The fur trade licensing arrangements that gave certain merchants monopoly access to specific territories. The timber rights that gave specific individuals the exclusive right to harvest the forests of specific regions. These were the foundations of the fortunes that, compounded over generations, produced the dynasties we have described. And beneath all of it, invisible in the official histories but present in the landscape itself, in the specific locations of the cities and the rivers and the forests and the farmland, is the evidence of the prior economy, the indigenous economy that was displaced not by some impersonal historical force, but by specific political decisions made by specific people for specific commercial reasons. The Mi'kmaq people of the maritime provinces had been trading with Europeans since the early 16th century, long before any permanent European settlement in the region. They had, over the course of that trading relationship, developed a sophisticated understanding of the European commercial system and a complex set of relationships with European traders that were, by any measure, commercially sophisticated. The relationship was never one simply of naive, indigenous people being cheated by clever Europeans. Though that happened, it was a relationship between two commercial systems, one of which ultimately proved better armed and better connected to the political structures that controlled access to land. The Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes region, in whose territory Toronto sits, had been managing one of the most productive resource landscapes in North America for thousands of years. The fisheries, the forests, the agricultural possibilities of the Ontario lakeshore were all resources that Indigenous peoples had been utilizing and managing before any European arrived. The specific legal maneuvers by which those resources were made available for the kind of commercial development that produced the fortunes of the Toronto commercial establishment, including ultimately the Thompson and Stronach empires, are documented in the treaty records, some of which are now the subject of litigation and land claims that have not been resolved. In British Columbia, the situation is more acute because so much of the province was never subject to any treaty at all. The Coast Salish peoples of the Lower Mainland, in whose unceded territory Vancouver sits, never signed away their land rights. The commercial development of Vancouver, which produced the fortunes of the Pattison Empire and many others, occurred on land whose legal status, from the perspective of Indigenous law, remains contested. These are not comfortable facts. They are not the kind of facts that appear in the official narratives of Canadian success, but they are the kind of facts that become unavoidable when you start asking seriously where the money came from. Where did the money come from? It came from the land. The land was not available for private commercial development through any neutral process. It was made available through a specific historical sequence: the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, the organization of colonial land systems, the distribution of resources and rights through political networks, and the accumulation of commercial advantage by the specific families who were positioned through timing and connection and capability to take advantage of it. That is the first answer to the question. The deeper answer involves the specific mechanisms we have been describing: the political relationships, the regulatory advantages, the obscured foundations, the cultural transformations that turned original accumulation into legitimate dynasty. Those mechanisms are the second chapter of the story. The third chapter, the chapter we are living in now, involves the perpetuation of the system. The ways in which the wealth that was accumulated through the first two chapters is now being used to shape the conditions under which the next generation of accumulation will occur. The tax policies that benefit holders of large pools of inherited capital. The media landscapes that shape what questions get asked about wealth and power. The educational institutions that train the next generation of the professional class that serves the interests of established wealth. The political donation systems that ensure that the regulatory environment continues to be managed in ways that protect existing commercial positions. These are not secrets. They are visible to anyone who looks. The question is not whether they exist, but why we find it so difficult to look at them directly, to say out loud that the specific distribution of wealth in Canada is not the product of a neutral meritocracy, but the product of a specific history, a history that has been carefully managed to make the questions about it feel inappropriate. Let us go back to the very beginning, not to 1786, when John Molson bought his brewery, not to 1924, when K.C. Irving opened his gas station, not to 1957, when the McCain brothers built their first factory in Florenceville. Let us go back to the period that this country's official history almost never discusses, the period before there was a Canada at all, the period when the land that is now Canada was home to hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own relationships to specific territories, each with their own systems of governance and resource management and commercial exchange. Because there is something that the conventional story of Canadian wealth almost never acknowledges, something that sits beneath all of the specific family histories we have been examining, something that is, when you confront it directly, one of the most remarkable facts in the history of this continent. The land that became Canada was not empty. This seems like an obvious statement. Everyone knows that Canada had indigenous peoples before European colonization. Every Canadian schoolchild learns about First Nations and Métis and Inuit. The acknowledgement is in the standard repertoire of Canadian civic life. Land acknowledgements at the beginning of public events. Flags at half-mast on national days of mourning. The rhetoric of reconciliation. But knowing that the land was not empty and understanding what it means that the land was not empty are two different things. And understanding what it means requires going into the specific histories of the specific places where the specific fortunes we have been discussing tonight were built. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose territories include the region around what is now Montreal, where the Molson Brewery was built, is one of the most sophisticated political and legal systems ever developed in North America. The Great Law of Peace, the Constitution of the Haudenosaunee, predates the founding of the American Republic by centuries. It organized a confederacy of 6 nations across a vast territory in a way that maintained peace between them for generations, that created a system of governance through consensus rather than coercion, that had specific legal provisions for the management of land and resources that were, in their sophistication, comparable to anything in the European legal tradition of the same period. When the French and then the British colonial powers established themselves in the St. Lawrence Valley, they did not enter a political vacuum. They entered a landscape organized according to the Great Law of Peace. They negotiated sometimes with the Haudenosaunee and the other nations of the region. They made promises, many of which they broke. They used the specific legal and political tools of European statecraft, backed by superior military technology and by the catastrophic effect of European diseases on indigenous populations, to gradually reduce the territory over which the Haudenosaunee and other nations could exercise their own governance. The waterfront of Montreal, where Molson built his brewery in 1786, was within the territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. the specific legal status of that territory, the question of whether it had ever been properly ceded to the British Crown in a way that gave the Crown the right to grant it for private commercial development, has been debated by historians and lawyers ever since. What is not debated is that the treaty relationships in the region were incomplete, that the specific terms under which the Kanyen Keha Daka were supposed to have agreed to British governance were, in several documented cases, either not properly negotiated or subsequently violated. None of this stopped Molson from building his brewery, and it did not stop Molson's descendants from operating it for 2 centuries. The legal system that governed the transaction was the British colonial legal system, which had already made a set of foundational decisions about whose ownership claims it would recognize and whose it would not. Within that system, Molson's acquisition was clean. Outside that system, in the perspective of the Kanyen Kehaka, whose territory it was, the entire framework within which the transaction occurred was the product of a set of political decisions that they had not consented to. This is not a simple story of villains and victims. It is a story of 2 legal systems, 2 frameworks for understanding the relationship between people and land coming into conflict, and one of them having the military and political power to make the other one irrelevant for practical purposes. But irrelevant for practical purposes is not the same as wrong, and it is not the same as settled. The land claims and treaty rights cases that are currently making their way through the Canadian court system, many of them concerning territories that overlap with the commercial heartlands of the country's wealthiest families, are evidence that the conflict between those 2 legal frameworks has not been resolved. In British Columbia, the situation is particularly stark. The Proclamation of 1763, which established the framework for British management of Indigenous territories in North America, explicitly stated that Indigenous peoples' lands could not be taken without their consent through treaty. This principle was, in large parts of British Columbia, simply ignored during the colonial period. The colonial government of British Columbia proceeded to distribute land for commercial development, mining, logging, agriculture, and urban development without first negotiating the treaties that the law of the Crown itself required. The result is that the land on which the commercial fortunes of British Columbia are built, including the Pattison Empire's substantial real estate holdings, is land whose title has never been properly cleared, in the way that the Crown's own law required. The British Columbia Treaty process, which has been ongoing since 1992, is the current attempt to address this. It has produced a small number of treaties in specific territories. The vast majority of British Columbia remains unceded territory in the sense that the original peoples of those territories never entered into valid agreements with the Crown to transfer their interest in the land. This is not a metaphor or a rhetorical device. It is a legal fact, one that has been recognized by the Supreme Court of Canada in a series of increasingly unambiguous rulings: the Delgamuukw case of 1997, the Silcotin case of 2014. These decisions have established in Canadian law that Aboriginal title to land is real, that it survives the Crown's assertion of sovereignty, and that the Crown's past distribution of land for commercial development without First Nations consent was, in legal terms, done without authority. The practical implications of this legal reality for the fortunes we have been discussing are something that Canadian courts and Canadian governments are now slowly and with considerable political reluctance beginning to address. The specific terms of any resolution are not yet determined. The specific effects on the holdings of specific families are not yet clear. But the legal framework has shifted in ways that make the question of whose land this ultimately is far more open than the official story of Canadian wealth has ever been willing to acknowledge. There is something that I want to draw your attention to, something that sits in the spaces between all of the specific family stories we have been telling tonight. It is a quality of memory, or rather, a quality of forgetting. The families we have discussed tonight are not unique in Canadian history. They are the most prominent examples of a much larger pattern. Canada has hundreds of wealthy families whose origins, if traced carefully, reveal the same combination of elements: political relationship, regulatory advantage, obscured foundation, and cultural transformation. The Richardsons of Winnipeg, whose grain trading empire was built on the opening of the prairies and on specific relationships with the federal government's management of the grain trade. The Sobey family of Nova Scotia, whose grocery empire was built on community banking relationships and on the specific commercial geography of Atlantic Canada. The Caisse de dépôt et placement du Québec, not a family, but an institution which was created by the Quebec government in the 1960s and which has, over the decades, invested in ways that have consistently benefited the specific commercial families connected to the Quebec economic establishment. All of these stories have the same quality. They are stories of genuine capability, genuine work, genuine commercial contribution, combined with a set of advantages that were not available to everyone and that were not earned through commercial excellence alone. And all of them share the same quality of official narrative. The bootstrap story, the self-made story, the story that emphasizes capability while leaving in shadow the specific conditions that made capability productive. The quality of forgetting that these stories require is not the result of active suppression. It is the result of something more mundane and in some ways more troubling. It is the result of a culture that has decided over time that certain questions are appropriate and certain questions are not. That questions about hard work and commercial success are appropriate. That questions about the specific political and historical conditions that made commercial success possible are not appropriate. That the mythologies of the self-made entrepreneur and the immigrant success story and the pioneer who tamed the wilderness are the stories worth telling. That the stories about Freemason networks and prohibition bootlegging and colonial land grants and broken treaties and regulatory capture, those are the stories that make people uncomfortable, that feel somehow un-Canadian, that seem to be attacking the very foundations of the country rather than simply asking how those foundations were built. But foundations are important. How a thing is built determines what it can support and what it cannot. A country built on a myth of self-made success that actually reflects a history of political advantage and colonial dispossession is a country whose foundations are not what it thinks they are. And a country that does not know what its foundations are is a country that cannot have an honest conversation about where it is going. We have been having that conversation tonight, not to condemn the families we have discussed, not to suggest that the wealth they hold is illegitimate in any simple legal sense, not to argue that what was done in the colonial period can be simply undone now, or that the current generation of wealthy families is personally responsible for the decisions made by their ancestors, but to say clearly and directly that the story of Canada's wealthiest families is not the story that has been told, that the bootstrap narrative is incomplete, that the self-made mythology is selective, that the specific mechanisms by which these fortunes were created and maintained involve a history that most Canadians have never been asked to look at clearly, and that looking at it clearly is not an attack on the country. It is the beginning of the possibility of making it better. Because here is the thing that the mythology misses: the qualities that produce the genuine parts of these success stories, the intelligence, the work ethic, the commercial creativity, the willingness to take risks, those qualities are not unique to the families who have the fortunes. Those qualities exist throughout the population, distributed without reference to class or wealth or political connection. The reason those qualities produced great fortunes in these particular families, rather than in others, is not that the families had more of those qualities. It is that the families had access to conditions, political, legal, financial, historical, that allowed those qualities to produce at scale what they would otherwise have produced only at the level of comfortable local success. If those conditions were more broadly available, the distribution of wealth in Canada would look different. Not because the specific families we have discussed would be less wealthy in any simple sense, but because the wealth generated by the combination of Canadian resources, Canadian labor, and Canadian political and legal institutions would be more broadly distributed across the population that produced it. That is a political argument, and it is a contested one. There are Canadians who would disagree with it and who would argue that the specific distribution of wealth in Canada is the appropriate result of the meritocratic operation of a free market. But that argument depends on accepting the mythology, accepting the official story. It depends on believing that the families at the top of the wealth distribution are there because of superior capability rather than superior access. We have been examining the access tonight, and the examination changes the argument. There is one more family we have not discussed, one more dynasty whose origin story has a quality that is, in certain ways, more mysterious than any of the others. Not because the specific mechanisms of their wealth accumulation are more obscure, but because the specific way in which they have positioned themselves in the Canadian landscape, in the mythology of the country, is so complete and so effective that the questions we have been asking about the others almost never get asked about them at all. The Richardson family of Winnipeg. James Armstrong Richardson was born in Kingston, Ontario in 1885. His family had been in Kingston for generations, and they had been merchants of one kind or another, and there was money, not enormous money, but solid professional money, the kind of money that sent sons to university and gave them the foundation for a career in business. James Richardson moved to Winnipeg in the early years of the 20th century, at the moment when Winnipeg was transforming itself from a frontier trading post into the commercial capital of the Canadian prairies. The grain trade was the engine of that transformation. The opening of the prairies to agricultural settlement, combined with the construction of the railway system that connected prairie farms to the ports of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence, had created one of the most significant commodity markets in the world. Richardson entered the grain business. He was good at it. He built James Richardson and Sons into one of the dominant grain trading companies in Canada, and the Richardson family, over the following century, diversified the fortune into financial services, mining, real estate, and media. The Richardson story, in its official version, is entirely consistent with the patterns we have been describing. The family entered an industry at the right moment, had the right capabilities and the right political connections, and accumulated over generations a fortune that has been estimated at several $billion. But what makes the Richardson story interesting for our purposes tonight is not the specific mechanics of the grain trade, fascinating as those are. It is the specific location of the Richardson fortune's foundation. Winnipeg, the prairies, the agricultural settlement of Western Canada. The prairies were settled through a process that was, from the perspective of the indigenous peoples who lived there, one of the most deliberate and systematic dispossessions in the history of the continent. The numbered treaties, negotiated between the Crown and the various First Nations of the prairies between 1871 and 1921, transferred enormous tracts of land from indigenous nations to the Crown. The terms under which those transfers occurred, the specific things that indigenous peoples were promised in exchange for the land, and the extent to which those promises were kept is one of the most thoroughly documented and most consistently unresolved issues in Canadian legal and political history. The short version is this: the Crown negotiated treaties with prairie indigenous nations on the basis of promises, annuities, farm equipment, seed, continued access to traditional food sources, education for their children, health care, protection of their reserves from encroachment. Those promises were systematically and comprehensively broken. The reserves were smaller than promised, the annuities were inadequate, the farm equipment arrived late or not at all. The food supply was disrupted by the near extinction of the buffalo, which the Crown did little to prevent. The education provided through the residential school system was a cultural assault, not education. The reserves were repeatedly reduced in size through mechanisms that were, in many cases, of questionable legality. The result was the transformation of the prairie indigenous nations from self-sufficient peoples with sophisticated economies to communities living on inadequate reserves in conditions of poverty and dependence that were not accidental. They were the product of specific policy decisions made by specific governments over specific decades. And the land that was taken through that process, the vast agricultural landscape of the prairies, was distributed for settlement and commercial development. The specific mechanisms of that distribution, the Dominion Lands Act of 1872, the homestead system, the railway land grants, the various mechanisms by which specific individuals and companies received access to specific tracts of prairie land, those mechanisms created the commercial landscape into which James Richardson and his family entered when they moved to Winnipeg. The grain that the Richardson Company traded was grown on that land. The commercial infrastructure that the company used, the railway system, the elevator network, the port facilities, all of it was built on the basis of the land disposition that occurred through the treaty process and through the associated policies of the Dominion government. The Richardson fortune is, in this sense, a fortune built on the prairies. And the prairies were created, in the commercial sense, through a process that is, in its most important details, a process of dispossession. This is not unique to the Richardsons. Every fortune built on the prairies, every company that traded grain or managed land or operated in the agricultural economy of Western Canada was operating within a commercial landscape that had been created through the same process. The Richardsons are interesting not because they are uniquely implicated, but because the scale and longevity of their fortune makes them a particularly clear illustration of how original dispossession compounds over time into dynastic wealth. The Richardson family today is wealthy, philanthropic, and deeply embedded in the institutional life of Winnipeg. They have given their name to buildings and programs at the University of Manitoba. They have supported cultural institutions and hospitals. They are, by any ordinary measure, pillars of the community. But the community they are pillars of, the commercial community of Winnipeg and the broader prairie economy, was built on a foundation whose specific history, the history of the numbered treaties and the broken promises and the systematic impoverishment of prairie and indigenous nations, is a history that the official story of Canadian success does not dwell on. And so we come back to the question that opened this conversation, the question that we asked at the beginning and have been circling around ever since. Where did the money come from? The money came from the land. The land was made available through dispossession. The dispossession was organized through colonial, political, and legal systems that created a specific distribution of access and advantage. The families who were positioned by virtue of their timing and their political relationships and their specific capabilities to take advantage of that distribution did so. And over generations, through the mechanisms of holding companies and trusts and political relationships and cultural philanthropy, they consolidated that advantage into the dynastic fortunes that define the landscape of Canadian wealth today. None of this means that the individuals in these families are villains. Most of the people alive today who bear these family names were born into wealth they did not create and had no choice about. They are operating within a system they inherited, and most of them are operating within it in ways that are, by the norms of that system, entirely appropriate. They give to charities. They serve on boards. They pay the taxes that the law requires them to pay. They are, by the standards of the world they live in, good citizens. But the world they live in, the specific world of dynastic Canadian wealth, is a world whose foundations were built on things that are not consistent with the mythology of fair opportunity and earned success that the country tells about itself. This inconsistency is not something that can be resolved by condemning specific individuals or demanding specific restitutions, though there are contexts, specifically the context of Indigenous land rights, where specific legal remedies are appropriate and are being pursued. It is something that requires, at minimum, honesty. Honesty about what actually happened. Honesty about the specific mechanisms through which the specific distribution of wealth in Canada was created. Honesty about the relationship between the mythologies of self-made success and the actual histories of specific fortunes. The families we have discussed tonight are not exceptional. They are exemplary. They are the clearest examples of patterns that run throughout the history of Canadian capitalism, patterns that are the same in their structure even when they are different in their specific details. The pattern of the political relationship, the pattern of the regulatory advantage, the pattern of the obscured foundation, the pattern of the transformation of origin, the pattern of the cultural philanthropy that makes the questions feel inappropriate. Understanding those patterns does not require condemning the families. It requires being honest about the history. And being honest about the history requires asking the questions that the culture has decided not to ask. Why did a penniless 18-year-old from Lincolnshire become the most powerful commercial figure in British North America within a few years of arriving? Why did a family of liquor dealers from the prairies become one of the wealthiest families in the world within a generation of arriving in Canada? Why did a barber's son from Toronto end up with a television monopoly in Scotland? Why does a holding company in Montreal have more influence over Canadian federal politics than any elected institution in the country? Why does a single family in New Brunswick own essentially every newspaper in the province, the majority of the gasoline infrastructure, enormous tracts of forest, and significant portions of the province's industrial capacity? Why does a family that arrived from Austria with a few tools and the knowledge of how to make cheese in the Sicilian tradition end up as one of the largest dairy companies in the world? These questions have answers. The answers are complicated, and they involve genuine capability and genuine work, but they also involve specific political relationships and specific regulatory advantages and specific historical conditions that are not acknowledged in the official stories. The families appeared from nowhere. That is how it seems when you read the official stories. A penniless immigrant, a small-town barbershop, a failing bus route, a garage with a few employees, a gas station in Bouctouche, and then somehow an empire. But nowhere is never really nowhere. There is always somewhere. There is always a specific set of conditions, a specific set of relationships, a specific historical moment, a specific political advantage. The somewhere is always there, in the background, in the details, in the records that have never been fully examined. We have been examining some of those records tonight, and what we have found is not a simple story of corruption or conspiracy. What we have found is a story about how systems work, how systems of commercial advantage and political relationship and historical dispossession operating over generations produce the specific distribution of wealth that we see in Canada today. How those systems are maintained, not through overt coercion, but through the management of narrative, through the transformation of origin, through the cultural philanthropy that makes the questions feel inappropriate. The families appeared from nowhere, but they did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from the specific somewhere that Canada has always been, and has always been reluctant to look at directly. There is a river in Ontario called the Credit River. It flows south from the Niagara Escarpment through the farmland and suburbs west of Toronto and empties into Lake Ontario near the town of Mississauga. It is not a famous river. It does not have the historical prominence of the St. Lawrence or the commercial significance of the Fraser. Most Canadians who have heard of it know it only as a feature of the suburban landscape, a waterway you cross on the highway when you are heading west from Toronto. But the Credit River has a history. Before it was a feature of the suburban landscape, before the subdivisions and the highway overpasses, it was at the heart of one of the most significant land transactions in the history of Ontario, a transaction that illustrates with particular clarity the specific mechanisms through which the land of central Canada was made available for the commercial development that produced several of the fortunes we have been discussing tonight. In 1805 and again in 1818, the Crown negotiated what were called the Toronto Purchase and the Credit River Purchases with the Mississauga people, who had lived in the Credit River Valley and along the north shore of Lake Ontario for generations. The terms of these transactions, as recorded in the official documents, were extraordinarily favorable to the Crown and extraordinarily unfavorable to the Mississauga. The specific terms have been the subject of litigation. The Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation pursued a land claim based on these transactions and reached a settlement in 2010. The settlement, for an area that now includes the city of Toronto and a substantial portion of the most valuable urban real estate in Canada, was worth $145 million. $145 million for the land on which a city worth hundreds of billions of dollars has been built. The mathematics of that settlement tell you something about the relationship between the original dispossession and the fortunes that were built on it. The original transaction, however it was structured, transferred land of essentially unlimited future value for a fraction of its worth. The wealth generated by the development of that land over the subsequent 2 centuries went to the developers, the merchants, the manufacturers, and the commercial families who operated in Toronto. None of them were present at the original transaction. All of them benefited from it. The Thompson family built their media empire from Toronto. Roy Thompson's original radio stations were Ontario operations, connecting to and dependent on the commercial infrastructure of a city that had been built on land whose transfer had never been fully negotiated. The financial institutions that provided Thompson's early capital were Toronto institutions, banks and investment dealers whose operations depended on the stability and productivity of the Ontario commercial landscape, a landscape that rested on that foundational transfer. This is not a direct causal relationship of the kind that lends itself to simple legal remedy. The Thompsons did not personally negotiate the Credit River Purchases. They were not present in 1818. The connection between the original transaction and the Thompson fortune runs through 2 centuries of intermediary history, through the accumulation of commercial and legal and political decisions that collectively transformed a colonial land transaction into the foundations of a modern city, and from there into the commercial infrastructure that made a radio station in North Bay a viable business proposition. But the connection is real. It is real in the sense that every fortune built in Toronto, including ultimately the Thompson fortune, rests on a foundation that included the specific way in which the land of central Ontario was made available for commercial development, and that foundation involved transactions that, by the legal standards that the Canadian courts have now applied to them, were not fair. This is the deepest layer of the story we have been telling tonight, the layer that is furthest below the surface, that requires the most patience to excavate, that produces the most discomfort when it is brought into the light. It is the layer that connects every dynasty we have discussed to the specific history of the territory on which their fortunes were built. And it is the layer that the mythology of self-made success, the mythology that structures the official stories of all of these families, is most specifically designed to obscure. The mythology works by starting the story late. It starts the story with the immigrant who arrived, the young man who worked hard, the entrepreneur who saw the opportunity. It does not start the story with the question of why the opportunity existed in the first place. Why was there a waterfront in Montreal available for commercial development? Why were there vast tracts of prairie land available for agricultural settlement? Why were there forests in New Brunswick available for the timber trade? Why was there a city growing rapidly in Ontario, creating demand for radio and newspapers and all the other things that built the Thompson Empire? The opportunity existed because the land had been organized for commercial development through a specific historical process. That process began with the arrival of Europeans who brought with them a set of legal concepts, including the concept of private ownership of land that were foreign to the peoples who lived there. It continued through the specific political decisions of colonial governments to apply those legal concepts to territories that had never consented to them. It was completed, in practical terms, through the specific commercial transactions, the land grants and licenses and monopolies and regulatory advantages that we have been examining tonight. Understanding this does not require any of the families we have discussed to do anything specific in any immediate sense. It does not require the current generation of Molsons or Thompsons or Irvings or Westons or McCains to hand back what their ancestors accumulated. The legal situation is complex, the moral situation is more complex, and the political situation is more complex still. What it requires is honesty. Honest acknowledgement that the story that Canada tells about its wealthy families is incomplete, that the bootstrap narrative is a selection, not a fabrication, but a selection that leaves out the specific historical conditions that made the bootstrap story possible, that the land acknowledgements at the beginning of public events, the rhetoric of reconciliation, the recognition of treaty rights in judicial decisions, all of these are not simply gestures toward political correctness. They are the country beginning, slowly and with considerable reluctance, to be honest about its own history. There are voices in Canada who find this honesty threatening, who argue that examining the history of wealth and dispossession is an attack on the country's foundations, that it undermines the legitimacy of existing institutions, that it creates grievances where none need exist. Those voices are not entirely wrong in their description of the effect. Honest examination of the history does, in fact, challenge the legitimacy of certain existing arrangements. It does create, or rather reveal, grievances that the mythology has been designed to obscure. But a country that cannot be honest about its own history is a country that cannot address the specific injustices that history produced. And a country that cannot address those injustices is a country that is carrying a weight, hidden from its official self-image, but felt in the daily lives of the millions of people who did not benefit from the historical process that produced its wealthiest families, a weight that doesn't get lighter with time. The families appeared from nowhere. That was the question we started with, the question that opened this conversation on a night when the country was quiet and the money sat enormous and silent in its foundations, and nobody was asking the question out loud. They did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from the specific historical conditions that this country created, conditions that involved colonial dispossession and political advantage and regulatory favoritism and the specific management of the commercial landscape in ways that rewarded the few at the expense of the many. Those conditions produced the specific distribution of wealth that Canada has now. That distribution is not the result of a neutral meritocracy. It is the result of a specific history. History that can be examined. History that can be understood. History that, once understood honestly, creates the possibility of something that the mythology never has. Justice. Not the abstract concept, not the institutional gesture, but the practical, specific recognition that the specific distribution of wealth in this country is not the natural and inevitable result of a fair system operating over time, that it is the product of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments that could have been made differently and whose effects, compounded over generations, have produced the specific landscape of inequality that Canadians live in today. The families will keep their money. That is not the point. The point is the honesty. The point is the willingness to look directly at the history and say, this is what happened. This is how it worked. These are the specific mechanisms through which the specific families at the top of the wealth distribution got there, and some of those mechanisms are not consistent with the story this country tells about itself. Say that out loud. Make it part of the official story. Stop managing the narrative and start examining the foundation. That is what the question is asking. That is what all of these families, in their different ways, have been avoiding having to answer. Not through malice, but through the operation of a system that has, for generations, made the avoidance feel appropriate. Normal. Canadian. It is not normal, it is a choice. And like all choices, it can be made differently. On the night you are listening to this, somewhere in Canada, money is moving in ways that are not quite visible. Regulatory decisions are being made in offices where the specific relationships between the regulators and the regulated are not fully documented. Commercial advantages are being accumulated by families and institutions whose specific methods are not fully examined. The pattern is continuing in the ways that patterns always continue, through the operation of systems that have been optimized over generations for the specific outcome of continuing. The families are still there. The money is still there. The questions are still not being asked. But tonight, in the specific hours of darkness and quiet in which you are listening, we have asked some of them. And asking the questions, it turns out, is the beginning of everything. There is a particular quality of Canadian silence. It is not the silence of ignorance. Canadians are, as national populations go, among the more educated and the more historically literate in the world. They know in general terms that their country has a history of colonial dispossession and that the relationship between the Crown and Indigenous peoples is complicated. They know that some of their largest corporations have, at various moments in their histories, engaged in practices that were legally or ethically questionable. They know that wealth and political power tend to coexist in close proximity, that the revolving door between corporate boardrooms and government offices is a feature of Canadian political life. They know all of this, and yet the specific questions, the specific connections between specific families and specific historical advantages, the specific mechanisms by which the general pattern translated into the specific fortunes, those questions are not asked in Canadian public life with any consistency. The silence is not the silence of not knowing. It is the silence of having decided not to ask. Why is that decision made? Part of the answer is psychological. The mythology of Canadian niceness, of polite restraint, of not making people uncomfortable by saying difficult things directly is a real cultural feature. Canadians are, by international comparison, genuinely reluctant to engage in the kind of direct political and economic confrontation that would produce the conversations we have been having tonight. The culture values accommodation, compromise, and the management of conflict through institutional channels, rather than through direct challenge. Part of the answer is structural. The media landscape in which Canadians receive information about wealth and power is, in significant measure, owned by the same families whose wealth and power it would need to examine. When the family that owns the newspapers also owns the largest commercial enterprises in a province, as in New Brunswick, the space for examination is structurally limited, not through overt censorship necessarily, but through the subtler operation of editorial priorities, advertiser relationships, and the self-interest of journalists who understand which stories will be pursued and which will be left alone. Part of the answer is historical. Canada is a young country in the sense that its national mythology is recent. The specific stories that Canadians tell about themselves, the stories of immigrant success and frontier adventure and peaceful nation building, are stories that were constructed in large measure in the 20th century, and they were constructed specifically to provide a national identity for a country that was otherwise held together primarily by geography and by the British imperial connection. Those stories served important functions. They created a sense of shared identity across an enormously diverse population. They provided the emotional foundation for the national project. They are not simply propaganda, though they have elements of that. They are the stories through which Canadians understand themselves, but they are incomplete stories, and the incompleteness has consequences. A country that believes its wealthiest families got where they are through superior merit in a system that offers equal opportunity to all is a country that is unlikely to examine the specific mechanisms by which those families actually got there. It is a country that is likely to view inequality as the natural result of differences in individual capability, rather than as the accumulated product of specific historical advantages compounded over generations. It is a country that is likely to be resistant to the kinds of structural changes in tax policy, in corporate governance, in the management of natural resources, in the recognition of indigenous rights that would produce a more genuinely equal distribution of the wealth that the country generates. And that resistance, that reluctance to examine the foundations, is itself a form of advantage for the families who benefit from the existing distribution. Every generation that passes without examining the specific mechanisms of the original accumulation is a generation in which those mechanisms are further obscured, in which the transformation of origin is further advanced, in which the bootstrap mythology is further entrenched. The Molson family has now been producing beer in Canada for over 200 years. The Thompson family has been controlling media in Canada for nearly a century. The Irving family has been controlling the commercial landscape of New Brunswick for nearly a century. 200 years is a long time, long enough for a dynasty to become a monument, long enough for the specific history of how the dynasty was created to be not so much forgotten as simply not relevant, simply ancient, simply the way things have always been. But 200 years is not so long in the history of the land. The Kanyen'kehá:ka people had been living in the St. Lawrence Valley for centuries before John Molson arrived. The Mi'kmaq people had been living in the Maritimes for millennia before K.C. Irving was born. The Anishinaabe had been managing the Great Lakes region long before Roy Thompson's father picked up a pair of scissors. The Mississaugas of the Credit had been living along the north shore of Lake Ontario for generations before James Armstrong Richardson went to school in Kingston. 200 years is not forever. It is, in fact, quite recent. The specific decisions that created the conditions for the specific fortunes are not ancient history. They are, in the context of human civilization, almost current events. The treaties that organized the land transfers of the prairies were signed within living memory of people who are now in their 90s. The specific regulatory decisions that gave certain commercial families monopoly advantages in certain sectors were made within the lifetimes of people who are alive today. The specific financial arrangements through which prohibition profits were transformed into legitimate distillery empires were completed within the lifetimes of people who are still alive. The history is not ancient. It is recent, and it is still operating. Let us visit one more dynasty, one that does not fit easily into the categories we have been using, one that is less well known than most of the others, but that illustrates with particular clarity a dimension of the story that the more prominent examples sometimes obscure. The Burkes family of Montreal. Henry Burkes and Sons was founded in 1879 by Henry Burkes, a jeweler who had immigrated from England to Montreal in the 1860s. The Burkes family built their jewelry business into one of the most prestigious retail brands in Canada, with stores across the country that were, for much of the 20th century, the destination for engagement rings and wedding gifts and the kind of luxury purchases that marked life's significant moments for middle and upper middle class Canadians. The Burkes business is interesting not because of its scale, which is significant, but not in the same category as the fortunes we have been discussing, but because of its location. Henry Burkes established his flagship store on Philip Square in Montreal, an address that was, in the late 19th century, at the center of the commercial and social life of English Montreal. Philip Square was surrounded by the institutions of the English-speaking establishment, the banks, the insurance companies, the law firms, the clubs. The English-speaking establishment of Montreal in the late 19th century was a specific social formation. It was a community of approximately 60,000 people, a minority within the much larger French-speaking population of the city that controlled the majority of the city's commercial and financial activity. The concentration of economic power in the hands of this minority and the specific relationship between that concentration and the political organization of post-Confederation Quebec is one of the most documented and most discussed features of Quebec's social history. The English-speaking commercial establishment of Montreal had, from the period of the British conquest in 1760, enjoyed a set of advantages in the commercial and financial landscape of the city that were the product of specific political decisions by the British colonial government. Those advantages persisted through Confederation and through the first century of Canadian history, maintained through a combination of capital accumulation, educational institutions, social networks, and political relationships that gave the English-speaking minority a commercial position far exceeding its proportion of the population. The Burkes family entered this landscape and became part of it. They built their business within the specific commercial ecosystem of English Montreal, benefiting from the social networks, the customer base, and the commercial infrastructure of a community whose own position in the city was itself the product of a specific historical advantage. None of this makes the Burkes business illegitimate. The jewelry was real, the craftsmanship was genuine, the business was well managed. But the specific landscape in which it was built, the specific community it served, and that supported it, was a landscape and a community whose position in the city was itself the product of a prior history that involved the political subordination of the French-speaking majority. The quiet revolution of the 1960s, which transformed Quebec society and which specifically targeted the economic privileges of the English-speaking establishment, began to change this landscape. Many English-speaking commercial families left Montreal. Many businesses relocated or declined. The Burke's business struggled in the later decades of the 20th century, was acquired by interests outside the family, and has gone through various iterations of ownership since. The transformation of the Montreal commercial landscape from English-speaking dominance to something more closely reflecting the actual population of the city is a story about the redistribution of commercial advantage. It is a story about what happens when the political conditions that maintained a specific set of commercial privileges are changed by a political movement that refuses to accept those privileges as natural and legitimate. It is, in that sense, a story about what is possible, about the relationship between political decisions and the distribution of commercial advantage, about the fact that the specific landscape of wealth and power in any given society is not natural and inevitable, but the product of specific political decisions that can be made differently. The Quiet Revolution did not produce perfect equality in Quebec. It did not eliminate the structural advantages of inherited wealth or the political advantages of established commercial networks. But it did shift the distribution of advantage significantly in ways that had real effects on real people's lives, in ways that created space for French-speaking Quebecers to participate in the commercial life of their own city in ways that had been systematically denied to them before. That is what political examination of the foundations of wealth can produce. Not perfect equality, not the elimination of all advantage, but the shifting of specific privileges that were built on specific historical injustices in ways that make the distribution of the society's wealth more consistent with the society's stated values. Canada has not had its quiet revolution at the national level. The specific examination of the foundations of the country's largest fortunes, the specific questioning of the political relationships and regulatory advantages and historical dispossessions through which those fortunes were created, that examination has not happened in Canadian public life in any sustained or effective way. But the conditions for it exist. The Supreme Court of Canada has, in a series of landmark decisions, recognized Indigenous title and treaty rights in ways that directly challenge the legal foundations of several of the fortunes we have discussed. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has produced a public record of the specific ways in which the policies of the colonial and post-Confederation period produced the specific outcomes that we have been describing. The investigative journalism tradition in Canada, though chronically underfunded, has produced important examinations of specific aspects of corporate concentration and political commercial relationships. The information is available. The legal framework is shifting. The political conversation, however slowly, is changing. What has not yet happened is the synthesis, the bringing together of the specific family stories, the specific legal history, the specific political relationships, the specific Indigenous history into a single coherent narrative that allows Canadians to understand clearly, without mythology, without the bootstrap narrative, without the selective presentation of the official story, how the specific distribution of wealth in their country was actually produced. That is what we have been attempting tonight, not as a condemnation, not as a call to any specific political action, but as an honest look at the specific history, a refusal to accept that the questions are inappropriate. The money did not appear from nowhere. It appeared from the land. The land was not empty. The people who were there before are still there. The history is still alive. The questions are still worth asking, and you have been listening to them tonight. In the morning, Canada will be the same country it was when you began listening. The same families will hold the same fortunes. The same political relationships will continue. The same mythologies will be reproduced in the same media and the same educational institutions and the same civic ceremonies. but you will know something that you did not know before, not because the information is new, but because it has been arranged in a way that allows you to see the pattern that connects the specific family stories to the specific historical conditions, the pattern that connects the historical conditions to the specific decisions, the pattern that connects the decisions to the specific distribution of wealth, the pattern that connects the distribution of wealth to the specific quality of life of every person in the country. That pattern is not fate. It is not natural law. It is not the inevitable result of a neutral meritocracy operating over time. It is history, and history can be examined. And examined history can be the foundation for something different that is worth knowing. Whatever time it is, wherever you are listening from, that is worth being awake for. There is one last thread to pull, one that runs through all of the others and connects them to something even older than any of the family histories we have examined. It sits not in the archives of colonial land grants or the records of Prohibition-era liquor licenses, but in the landscape itself. Canada covers nearly 10 million square kilometers. It holds more fresh water than any other country. It contains some of the largest deposits of minerals and fossil fuels on the planet. Its forests are among the most extensive on Earth. Its agricultural land, particularly in the prairies, is among the most productive in the world. This is an extraordinary endowment. A country with this combination of land, water, forests, minerals, and agricultural capacity, combined with a small and well-educated population and a stable governance system, should be, by any reasonable expectation, one of the most broadly prosperous societies on Earth. And Canada is, by international comparison, quite prosperous. But prosperous on average is not the same as prosperous for everyone. And the specific distribution of that average does not reflect what you would expect from a neutral meritocracy. The gap between the wealthiest families and the rest of the population has grown consistently for 4 decades. The mechanisms of that growth, the financialization of the economy, the specific tax policies that favor capital over labor, the governance structures that transfer wealth from workers and communities to shareholders, those mechanisms have been shaped consistently by governments in close relationship with the families who have benefited most. The official story is resilient and appealing. The immigrant who arrived with nothing. The barber's son who turned a radio station into a global media company. The prairie farmer's grandson who built the world's largest French fry producer. The tool and die maker from Austria who created a great automotive supplier. The Sicilian cheesemaker whose family became global dairy giants. These are good stories. The capability was real. The work was real. The contribution was real. But they leave out the specific political relationships, the regulatory advantages, the historical conditions, colonial dispossession, immigrant community networks, prohibition-era gray zones, post-war media, licensing arrangements that created the specific opportunities. Include them, and you have a complex and honest examination of how a specific society distributes its opportunities and its wealth. Canada says it values equality of opportunity. Canada says it is engaged in reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples whose land the country was built on. These are good values, but values only mean something when used as a standard against which practice is measured. The families appeared from nowhere, the official story says. We have shown tonight that nowhere is a place with a specific history. That history is not over. It is continuing in every regulatory decision and every tax policy and every land claim, in every household where the question of who gets what is being asked, and in every family that is asking it. The country that Canada is becoming will be shaped by how it answers the questions we have been asking tonight. Whether it continues managing the mythology or whether it chooses to look honestly at the foundations, acknowledge the specific history, and make the decisions that a society taking its own values seriously must eventually make. The families came from somewhere. Now you know some of the specific places. What you do with that knowledge is entirely up to you. But the country that becomes something better begins with the people who are willing to ask the question,